I really was sort of an average soldier. Channel blew up to 1.5 million subscribers because I offered this new perspective that a lot of people, I feel like, it was missing from the conversation of like, what is the regular grunt think? What's his perspective? There was a lot of times where I'm like in a Black Hawk helicopter or a Chinook, or we're doing a raid on a house and I'm kicking in a door and I'm like, they're paying me to do this. I would do this for free. The government, those suckers. And then there were other moments where I was very close to quitting. When your beliefs are shaken, you tend to like become nihilistic and start to think that, oh, well, if I was wrong about that, I was probably wrong about everything. What could I possibly be right about? But then over the years, I matured a little bit, I like to think. And now I've realized...
Do people talk politics in the military, or do people... Hey guys, welcome to Bridges, episode 8. I'm Steven. I'm joined today by Kyla, and we have a special guest from Task and Purpose. My Chris Cappy. I remember the Cappy, but I forgot the Chris part. I want to call you Brian. You emit a lot of Brian energy.
I look like a Brian.
You super
I've been
look like
told
a Brian.
that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Parents almost named me that.
Really? They messed up.
Well, they couldn't even know what you were going to look like. That doesn't make sense.
I mean, they had an estimate if they're his parents. Probably look something like them.
True.
Yeah, that's how genetics work.
That's why I've got Kyla here, okay? Because I forget stuff like that.
Well, welcome. Before we get started, I'll let us know our sponsors. We have 3 sponsors for today's episode. Ground News, as always, my favorite form. Have you signed up to your Ground News yet?
I've been on Twitter for a lot of news recently. I heard that's where the good political commentators get their news from.
That is actually.
They go through a lot of Twitter threads.
45 tabs open. It's really good. You can check out our promo code. It's in the description, but it's also checkgroundnews/Bridges podcast. We're also supported by Skillshare, which is a collaborative community where only $10 a month you can join to watch classes on almost anything or teach your own classes. Basically, you sign up and it's like a massive community of nerds who know lots about tech and art and everything.
Don't make Chris's mistake and waste money on a formal education for a film when you can just go to Skillshare.
You could go to Skillshare.
Yeah.
Do you regret
So cheap.
NYU because you could have gone to Skillshare?
They didn't have Skillshare back then. I wish they did.
You would have done that.
No, that's true. I keep forgetting that sometimes. People pose me questions about like grade school stuff, like why did you guys use physical lunch cards instead of like digital stuff? And I have to think for a while. I'm like, oh, we didn't really use computers or the internet that much back then.
Yeah,
it feels really weird to say.
I never used my smartphone back then. Why?
Yeah. So those are our sponsors for today.
Do you say you were Army or?
Yeah, it was Army National Guard, 11 Bravo Infantry.
Gotcha. When you're covering, I guess, like military stuff now, and you're focused on, do you say that you're focused more on like the bureaucracy of things? Can you explain what you mean by that?
So these weapons procurement programs they're basically, it's the Army working with industry in the United States. Your Raytheons, your Lockheed Martins, Sig Sauers, and they're collaborating together. And anytime you have giant corporations, government, there's a ton of bureaucracy, red tape, and I mean, it has to be there. It's there for good reason because there's millions, billions of dollars of taxpayer money that needs to be accounted for. So what a lot of people cover is the ins and outs of what they call military procurement. Perun is a YouTuber he's amazing at covering this in particular.
Okay.
But yeah, I love covering that aspect of it because so right now, the Army's going through a transition phase. Pretty much every 20, 30 years this happens, where they completely transform how the U.S. Army, Marines, Navy, how they operate. So the way they get there is by acquiring new weapon systems, new vehicles, through a procurement system. That's kind of what I mean by the bureaucracy of it.
Private industry and entrepreneurship as well. Is there a fair bit of like red taping around like development as well? Like we're talking about these new NVGs, which is probably a private enterprise that developed it, but it's probably through a government contract, which is again the weird duality of contracting researchers and development for weapons.
Call it the military industrial complex.
Yeah.
It's the MIC. I cover that essentially.
Okay, that's what you're interested in.
Yeah, that's a lot of what we cover. Outside of there's also the conflicts and the wars, but yeah, military procurement is difficult because it has to be competitive. There needs to be competition. So it's multiple companies are competing for that contract that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So you've got like L3 Harris is in competition with Vortex or whoever to create those. They're basically trying to create that NVGs for the Army.
You know, I'm just curious actually. This is an off the top of your head. Do you know if you were to look at the profits of like Glock or SIG or any of these large firearms manufacturers, So the majority of their profits or revenue from government contracts, so that's like a huge chunk of what they do, or is it like way more civilian sales?
That's a good question. I would say it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
So for SIG, for instance, I don't know. I believe probably now if they win that next generation squad weapon contract, and if the government decides to execute it at the maximum level, so they say, okay, we're going to acquire 120,000 of these rifles, then maybe that would change the revenue. I don't have the exact numbers.
Curious.
Yeah.
Like when they swapped out the M9, right? They don't use that anymore?
For another SIG weapon, right. The M9 Beretta was replaced by the SIG, I forget but when I was in, it's the M9, but now they have a new one. Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, like when the government wants to swap out for their standard issue stuff, are all the manufacturers tripping over themselves to be like the next like standard issue? But then I guess there's also a lot of consumer prestige as well, because like AR-15s and M4s are like, this is what the government uses, the military, and
they're competing. They're all like in that bid, it was True Velocity, Textron, and SIG, and they're all competing with each other, trying to win that contract.
Okay, backing up a lot. How old were you when you got out of the service?
I got out. I was 24, I believe.
I feel like there is very divergent paths on people's interest in the military, that when some people get out, they don't care. It was like a part of their life. They're done, whatever. And then some people are more interested in it afterwards. So obviously you've taken a much greater interest. Why?
At first I wasn't. At first I wanted nothing to do with it. When I got out, I was like, don't ever show me a range card again. I don't want to see another. Don't talk to me about ROE. I don't know.
Were you just like burnt off of it, or burned out? Or?
I was burned out, but now, okay, so I'll say at the end of the story, I got to a place where now I took something that was kind of a chip on my shoulder, made me feel different from everyone. When I was in school, I felt like I couldn't relate to people because I'm like, oh, well, you're complaining about having to get up at 8 in the morning. I had to get up at 5 in the morning in the Army.
Right.
And that's like not a good attitude to go through life with. I knew that I had adjusted when finally I got the wrong order from Starbucks. They gave me the wrong thing and I was like, ah. I'm like, oh, I feel normal again. I can be upset about petty things. That's nice.
Okay.
So to your question, when I first got out, I wanted nothing to do with it. I was the guy in the Army. I always say on my channel that like I was the average infantryman, and that's not me trying to be self-deprecating. I really was sort of an average soldier. So when I got out, I wasn't the guy that knew the maximum range of every weapon system by heart. That wasn't me. So I kind of refound it.
That stereotype, it actually drives me crazy, because when you talk about, it's especially true of people in intelligence, that if somebody knows somebody that worked for like the CIA or the NSA, like I know some of these guys and they're just like normal, like cool people. They're usually like decently smart, they work, but the average understanding is like, that's Jason Bourne. Like, you worked for the CIA, like, so were you at like every black site or just like a couple of them? Or for like military guys, it's like, oh my God, if I give you a pistol, can you like kill a guy at like 300 yards, like in a crowd of people? Yeah, that's the standard assumption for people that work in military intelligence. Is insane. Yeah,
that's how, and people would approach me that way. They would think, oh, so since you were in the Army, you're clearly a badass, right? And I was like, no, I was kind of the guy behind the guy that was like guarding the guy that was the special forces guy.
Yeah.
I
was just like there, man.
Yeah. I did stuff.
Had a gun.
Yeah. You hear from special forces dudes all the time, and I love hearing from them. Their perspective is
they're
easily
what sets
extremely
this aesthetic, right? They're so intense. Like, think of like the David Goggins type. They're just like
something to
live up to. Even their stuff is very, and we're going to get into this later. I should be writing notes because I'm going to ask you later about, it has to do with Gaza stuff, because I think people have these insane assumptions about special forces people that do you play video games at all?
Yeah.
Special forces are like hero units where it's like, okay, well, if I've got 10,000 bad guys I need to get rid of, I could either use 10,000 of my soldiers, or I could use like 50 special ops soldiers who will go and kill all 10,000 people, because that's what they do, rather than being like geared towards like highly specialized types of missions. That was a talking point that came up a lot prior to any of the invasions in the Gaza Strip, where it's like, why doesn't Israel just send in special forces to like kill everybody? And it's like, I don't think it works that way. Yeah.
Well,
wouldn't that be nice though?
Yeah, it would be cool. Yeah,
it would be cool. It would be so simple. I feel like that must contribute to the other, like you said, you were so like burnt out and stuff when you came back, that I feel like it would also be otherizing that like civilians now have this expectation from you of like, oh, you're a military guy, so you're badass, you know, you can kill someone from 300 yards, you're probably really intense, you know, there's a like, that must be a really hard part of the transition as well.
So that's what what YouTube did for me was, it was kind of therapeutic.
Yeah.
It took a way where I could communicate and connect with people in the military community in a way that I found satisfying and productive, and it didn't have to have that expectation of me. And by the first thing I would always do is kind of like break people's expectation and just tell people like, I was a terrible shot. And again, not trying to be self-deprecating, like I'm left eye dominant, so it's like harder to see the gun. I'm not.
Why are you
wasn't good at
that?
Shooting because it makes it harder.
I'm missing. I just don't understand. I don't know guns at all. So.
I took a friend to the range one because she wanted to shoot rifles, and she could not look down a scope and fire. And I spent, it must have been a good like 5 or 10 minutes because she kept saying like the things don't line up. And I'm like, they line up. And she was left-handed. And I'm like, it doesn't matter that you're left-handed, like they will line up. It has to line up. And it took me like a good 10 minutes. And I finally, like, I'm looking at her. And then I realized that she's like looking down the side right here. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm so stupid. Yeah, because when you're shooting, whether you shoot 2 eyes open or 1 eye open, you have to know if you hold your finger over something and you block it, you can
tell what your dominant eye is.
Yeah, dominant eye is. And if you're left eye dominant, the sight should go over your left eye. But I think firearms are typically built for right-handed people with right eye dominance.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's not the firearm itself is usually it's ambidextrous. Like you could shoot it from either side, but the problem is you're now having to like lean over to see if it makes it more difficult.
Sure. Well, like because if you're left eye dominant, you should shoot from your left, right? Wouldn't you?
Because if you're left eye dominant, that means I'm righty, right?
You're right-handed.
That's what I mean. So that's why it's a problem.
Gotcha.
If you're
left,
yeah,
it's fine.
So that's when it becomes an issue.
Well, it's weird too because you're hitting because your safety and your select fire are going to be different too. But it's not as big of a deal.
Okay,
but yeah. Okay. But anyway,
so like that's kind of what made I feel like probably the channel blew up to 1.5 million subscribers because I offered this new perspective that a lot of people I feel like it was missing from the conversation of like, what does the average infantryman feel? What is the regular grunt, the ground pounder think? What's his perspective? You never really hear it, and you don't get a chance because usually where else would you get a voice except for YouTube? So I feel like that's kind of what blew the channel up was.
It's also really crazy to think, we have a volunteer military. Do you know what the average age is of a deployed soldier?
If I would assume it's probably 19, 20. I was
crazy.
the youngest. I was the youngest dude in at least the entire company. I was 19 when I deployed. So
crazy.
And I always wished that people had that I knew more, not just about the weapons, but the actual conflict itself.
Yeah.
I wish I had known more going into it about the geopolitics of Iraq, Iran, what would this all mean? Like it's turned out, I think in hindsight, that Putin likes to say that the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the century was the Soviet Union collapse. I think it was, for us, the United States going into Iraq, because when we left, basically created a vacuum. Iran stepped in. They have more influence there.
Yep.
So, sorry, I'm getting off topic, but basically all this is to say, I wish I knew more about these things going in. And that's part of what I try to do is try to tell average troops kind of, even if you're struggling to understand these things, like I don't know everything, but I'm trying, right?
I'm so curious because when you say like the average age was like probably 19, 20, 21 of these like typically young men, I know there's kind of this like saying or view that the army is like basically welfare for disenfranchised men and like young, like I don't know how you feel about that. That's something that I always get told. I don't know if I agree with that's true. But I can't imagine being like young and 20. You probably don't know anything about the world. You've like just come out of high school, and you're getting like a gun and going into like cross-cultural situations where like pretty like major, oftentimes like moral decisions are on your shoulders and like pressures that you'll never experience anywhere else in your life are on you. And I think about like the development of like a 21-year-old brain at the time is just like it's like right around that window is when it's probably why you see college students are always like obsessed with like world politics and protesting and stuff. It's because in large part like our moral foundations really start getting wrestled with in like those early 20 ages. And I just can't imagine the impact that would have for a 21-year-old being in the military in that developmental window specifically.
Everyone I knew was definitely between 18 and 22, because I remember calling anyone that was over 32 old balls. That was their nickname immediately. We had one guy, we call him Old Balls, and he loved to sing, what was it? I forget the name of the band. But yeah, there's studies that have been done about exactly that, what you're talking about, which is that when I was in Iraq, my brain was basically bathed in adrenaline, bathed in just being, essentially, they called it like a high alert status all the time. So I'm constantly worried and on alert. And that does something. It changes your brain, from what I heard, permanently. So yeah, at those ages, those development ages, when you're 21 and you're constantly worried about maybe tomorrow you're gonna go hit an IED and be dead.
Yeah.
It definitely, it's part of the reason why, like, when I got back, I stayed away from military stuff for so long. But you brought up if I feel like it's welfare for troops.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that. I don't know anything about it. It feels obviously
we could get
icky in approach of what people are saying, but I'm not sure.
I don't think it's icky. The military is an amazing opportunity. Like, I pretty much owe my career to it. I don't regret it.
Yeah. It gets a really bad rap, considering you have like job training, free education. The military is the only thing that I personally have ever seen where if you take somebody and they like have issues in life, you can like stick them in the military and you could actually get some serious like changes in the person's like behavior. Although I have also heard that those people can have trouble when you come out, you lose that structure. I guess actually that's kind of a question, because you can talk about that. When you came out and you had to readjust to civilian life, and then I guess you went to school after you came out of the military for film?
I dropped out of film school to go into the military. Okay. And then I volunteered to go with the next National Guard unit that was deploying to Iraq. Mm-hmm. They said I was crazy because I had to get my commander to sign off. He was like, "Are you sure you want me to transfer you to this unit? They're going to war. You know that, right?" Mm. And I was 19. And I was like, "Yeah, let's do this." Okay. Totally.
Gotcha.
So they transferred me over to that unit. And
what was your big driver? Why were you so motivated?
I joined the Army because I wanted to deploy.
Okay.
I wanted to go. But I'm sorry, you were asking something about...
Yeah, but hold on. I'm interested, because you didn't just want to deploy. It sounds like you wanted to, like, you thought there was, like, some nobility in this war or something. Like, what was the path to, like, I want to take part in this? Was it, like, did 9/11 hype you up, or what?
Yeah, there was a lot of reasons and variables. One of them was 9/11. Like, another one was I was in art school, and I was the kid that was just loved Bush, loved Iraq, like 100% for it. Used to listen to talk radio all the time with my dad growing up. So this was me. This is it. This is noble, like you said. This is right. And some kid, we were drinking one day in art school, and we're talking about Iraq, and I'm like, "This is so good." And he's like, "If you really think it's so good, why don't you go there? What's stopping you?" And I was like, "That's a really good question." You know, like, he called me on my bullshit. And I thought about it, and I started thinking, I'm like, if I really do believe in this, and if I really do want to help out, and I do think I have something to offer to people, and I do think I could be of use and value, like, why don't I join? So pretty much the next day I went and started talking to the recruiters.
Were you like the only guy in art school that was super like war bent conservative type guy? Or?
They hated me. Yeah. Looking back on it, I was like, why do I have no friends here?
So you're in the ultimate leftoid sphere of like Hollywood, art, theater, like the most soy left, like like I did like kind of theater and then like band and stuff. So so I'm familiar with this space. Yeah. Where does the dichotomy come from, where you have the interest in those things, but you also have like the super conservative bend? Where do the two things come from?
Growing up, I was always into film, making movies in my backyard with kids, and then, but I also, like I said, with other kids. Yeah,
that's right. That just sounded really. I'm sorry. As an adult, my brain is quite. But the internet just. I'm so sorry. That sounded terrible. We'll cut that. I got
the kids together. That sounded so awful.
Hobby making as a child. Yeah. I understand. Go ahead. No, you're good.
Yeah, but like I listening to talk radio so much, and also, I mean, whether it was right or wrong, I don't really care. It came down to sort of like, this country has given me so much opportunity, and I felt like the least I could do was this is how I could give back. And I still feel that way.
Were your
And I
parents,
don't
like-
regret going. And whether Iraq was right or wrong, like, I'm glad I did it.
Yeah. Were your parents super conservative, or were they really political? Or
My dad, very, very conservative. Yeah.
do you have military background here for him?
Actually, the military background kind of on my mom's side. Her father was a Korean War veteran.
Okay.
And he actually, she was born like right after he got back from Korea. He had
Gotcha. Okay. So then or do you want to ask a question?
No, I'm going to derail a little bit.
So you, so then you were interested in filmmaking as a kid. Parents, or at least your dad was pretty conservative. You picked up a lot of his conservative beliefs. You still went to art school, still had your conservative beliefs, and then you decided to join the military. Why the Army over any other branch?
I don't like the water.
Don't like the water.
No.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
I've always wanted to be a grunt. Like,
Okay.
I always wanted to be a rifleman. That was kind of what I wanted to do. The Marine, it was either the Army or the Marines, and the Army were the ones that let you choose your job.
Sure.
So if I joined the Marines, I could have ended up anything, and I really wanted to make sure I could do kind of the experience I wanted. So, and also their boot camp, if you're an infantryman, it's the shortest boot camp.
Okay.
So it was a little bit of laziness too. I was like, I could knock this out over the summer,
Yeah.
knock war out over the next year, and then we'd
Okay.
be done.
I'm so curious, that conversation that lit a fire under, like, basically for you to go. What was it about that? Because I feel like most people that would have that conversation and get confronted, like, if you love Iraq, just go, wouldn't go. Like, most people wouldn't just go sign up the next day. They'd be like, yeah, well, that's true, and then, like, move on.
I had to look at myself in the mirror. Like,
Okay.
I had to, after that moment, I had to be a little bit self-reflective and realize, wow, I'm full of garbage. I say things, but I don't believe the things that I say, clearly. Like, you ever have that disconnect from, it kind of feels like you're not in sync. The things that you're saying aren't lining up with your actions.
Yeah, that, like,
And I had-
dissonance.
Yeah.
Every
It
now and then you
created
have a
cognitive-
hard moment that comes up in your life, and you're like, oh shit, I have said this thing, and now I'm like being tested, and oh no, yeah.
Right.
Oh,
yeah. And I kind of had an epiphany in that moment.
Okay.
And
You're also super hyped up on, I listen to all the same stuff, Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage, Ann Coulter, Glenn Beck.
There's, like, a
Billy Cunningham.
romanticization
Oh yeah,
of,
all
like,
these talk
war.
radio guys. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I still consider myself pretty conservative, but what I've tried to do with this channel, for instance, is be sort of unbiased as much as possible, or at least tell people when I'm biased or where I'm coming from. And that's something that I wish people would be a little bit more, in hindsight, if I was listening to those talk radio shows that are hyping you up, if they had said, oh, by the way, I'm very biased towards this. This perspective is, I'm way out there on this. I don't know, maybe it would have helped, but there were no voices like that. I feel as though in the 2000s.
You have to have, well, even today, I think when you present yourself, you are correct. And the idea that you would even acknowledge that there could be a bias in your opinion is like an admission of fault almost. So I think people won't do it.
Right.
Okay, so you have somewhat of a romanticized expectation, I would imagine, joining the military, fighting the good fight. I'm just curious on a personal level, what are some like expectation versus reality moments? Were there things when you got into the military where you were like, this is as cool as I thought it would be? And then other things where you were like, oh my God, MREs fucking suck. What were these? Yeah, I'm just curious, like, on a
Yes,
personal level. Yeah,
there
what
were a
feelings?
lot of both of those moments. I was that person that needed discipline badly in my
Okay.
life, and they gave me a lot of it to my face, and I benefited from it. But there was a lot of times where I'm like in a Black Hawk helicopter or a Chinook, or we're doing a raid on a house and I'm kicking in a door and I'm like, they're paying me to do this. I would do this for free. The government, those suckers. And then there were other moments, a couple of moments I remember in particular, where I was very close to quitting. We're trying to find a way. We call it in the military like a shit bag. Can I? I don't
Yeah,
curse
you're
much.
good. You're
but,
good.
Okay.
The ROE here allows swear words. You're fine. Don't worry. Yeah.
Weapons free on the cursing. But there were a few times where I wanted to be a shitbag and just quit. One of them, the first one was like the second night at boot camp, and they're at Fort Benning, Georgia, and they're screaming at us, and they don't give you covers, so we're just in these bunk beds, and I'm just freezing in the Georgia night.
Why no covers? There's got to be a reason for that.
I don't know, because it was the in processing.
training?
It was just the in processing
Okay.
part that you're in for like 11 days. You're at MAPS for or whatever they call it. No, MEPS is before that. It's the in-processing 30th AG.
Okay.
30th AG is a real treat if anyone's going to Benning right now. So the in-processing part of Fort Benning is there's no real what do you call it? Luxuries, no creature comforts at this
Like
place.
a blanket, yeah, gotcha.
Right. So I'm sitting there thinking, wow, I'm going to go home, right? I'm going to go tell them I'm quitting, like rip up my contract. And they make it sound like you can't quit, but if you want to quit and they'll let you.
It's a volunteer military,
yeah, like you can get out of your contract. So I was very close that night to just going up, and people did it. Lots of people did it. And people started washing out. By the end of when I was in, I mean, they were taking anyone with a pulse, but
I think that's part of MAPS, though, is to kind of like wash out people who aren't like resilient and gritty enough, essentially,
yes,
to make it through.
MAPS is the medical processing part that they do that. 30th AG as well. It's all mind games. They do, like, I can't listen to Barney or It's a Barbie World anymore because at boot camp they would just, and I won't make this me just telling boot camp stories, but they would play those over the loudspeakers, those songs, until like 2 a.m. They'd play I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world until 2 a.m. So just to screw with you, just to keep you awake and to test you. So those were some moments where I thought I could be back at art school right now, and that would be nice. I could have a 40, be playing Edward 40 hands, and that would be much better than this. But I'm glad that I stuck. The other moment was when I was when we were getting ready to go to Iraq. They would do a thing where they would train us we would watch videos of other soldiers how they died. And it's kind of a way to learn. It's one of the things that I think the Russian forces weren't doing was not learning from their mistakes. They weren't showing those videos to their troops. But watching those videos and seeing different ways, you see like a guy they would use a tactic where they would snipe one soldier, and then you see another soldier go to help his friend and help drag him out, and then they shoot that one.
Right.
And they're telling you, like, don't do that. Make sure that you stop the enemy fire before you go to someone who is downed. And as I'm watching these videos and seeing the tactics that they use, and they're showing you videos of dudes getting blown up by IEDs, and I'm thinking, I can't handle this. I'm the type of person, I'm pretty sensitive, a little bit of a little puss. So things that affect me more than I think other people. So that was another moment where I was like, I can't do this. And I was very close to quitting.
Of your whole military experience, you think the boot camp stuff was the most challenging?
The train up part was, because once you're over there, actually, no, there were moments then too, except at least then I felt like I was doing the job. I didn't have those thoughts of like quitting once I was over there, but the train up part, because they're
trying to make you quit a little bit. Like there's that pressure
in boot camp, yeah. But then once you're in train up, the part getting ready to go to Iraq, they stop. They're not with you anymore. You're out of boot camp.
But that's where
you're with your unit. But that's where you're watching that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So like reality is hitting in of what's coming up.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So you're deployed over in Iraq. What were the years? Do you say?
2009.
2009. Okay. It's been a while. Is this way after all of the big, like the clearing of Mosul and everything? Is this way after all the major fighting for everything?
Yeah, it's a weird part of the war where kind of the tail end of the war where the insurgency, it was right after the surge. So we're kind of the cleanup crew. We're the guys that are there. It's the occupation. And it's the part of the war where we're still going and doing raids and kicking in doors. It's very by, with, and through the Iraqi army and police forces. We're working with them.
Training them.
Going on all of our missions and all of our patrols alongside them.
And this would have been
stand them up.
way before ISIS or anything started appearing. So you're not dealing with like that type of stuff, right?
Technically, there were those elements. Like in Iraq, unlike somewhere like Gaza where it can't really be reinforced.
Right.
But in Iraq, we had a lot of dudes coming from Syria. We had Chechen guys trained by Russians that were coming to fight us. That's what you're looking at in Iraq. There's a lot of IEDs, a lot of bomb makers that were going on raids to capture. It's the part of the war where we're going out and our patrols were carrying, my platoon leader is carrying $100,000 worth of cash to just give to one of the local sheikhs to distribute, to basically pay them off to not attack us.
Oh,
and
interesting.
It's a part of the war that a lot of people don't know about,
Yeah.
and that I didn't know about. It's like, I thought we were going to get the bad guys.
Or we're paying the bad guys, kind of.
Paying them off to not kill us, and nation building. So it's a weird part of the war.
When you were deployed, did you do a lot of communication, fraternizing with citizens of Iraq or the people that were living there? Was it mainly just on base with your own people kind of stuff? Or
the most talking that I did with the locals would have been the Iraqi police officers and the Iraqi army, because I lived on base. Basically, picture a football field size base that's covered with essentially concrete walls, these big T-wall barriers.
Yeah.
And it's in the middle of a town, small rural town just north of Baghdad. And this was a counterinsurgency tactic that the United States used, was they put a company of infantry out in the middle of a town. They moved them out from the big bases, big FOBs, forward operating base. They moved them out into this actual towns. This way you're integrated with the people, and they come to you, and so I wasn't a leader, wasn't in a leadership position, wasn't an officer, but the officers would talk with the local people, and they would ask, what problems are you having? They'd say, your people are unemployed, because that's what drives terrorism a lot of times.
Yeah, man, with no jobs and nothing to do.
Right, exactly. And we disbanded their army, which was a genius move.
And their government, and banned everybody that was participating in it before from going back. And yeah.
Did you realize these things that you're listing right now of unemployment, loss of military, loss of government while you were there? Or is that stuff that you became more aware of after? Is that the things that you wish you knew?
I was aware of it in a tangential way, in that I was more worried about they brought Hot Pockets for us today, sick. And that was kind of what was all on my mind. Or oh, damn it, we have to go on patrol all day today. The immediate concerns, but I would always hear hey, so-and-so is at the gate and they're mad that we shot flares last night and it burned their house down and we need to pay them off. And so I would hear things like that, but the operational side I never thought about in the way that I do today. Where I'm looking through white pages and reading reports that officers have written about things like that, where they're we had to pay $20,000 to so-and-so because we accidentally, and this is what we did over there, we ran somebody's house over with our armored vehicle and crushed it. It was one of their homes with our Striker. And so at the time I was we just hit something. But now I think about, we just ruined someone's house.
Yeah.
For narrativizing this, when you were over there, to the U.S. public, we're the great saviors, the great liberators, and these are basically, slum-dwelling people that are worshiping us coming back. I remember that the videos that they would show us would be them pulling down the statues of Saddam Hussein, and they welcome American democracy, and obviously this is a bit overhyped and misrepresentative of what the people there feel. What was your impression of, what did you go over there feeling? Did you have that same narrative in your head? Did that conflict with what it was like dealing with Iraqi police officers? Or, what was that?
Yeah, I was kind of hoping. I was 19 and thought, we're going to serve them the best dish of democracy. And they're not going to like it at first, but then they're going to get used to it and they're going to enjoy it. Not realizing the whole history of that region and how maybe they don't want that. Maybe that's not what they need right now. You can kind of understand why the United States thought that they could go in there and just make it a democracy. You look at, there was great success in Europe when the Soviet Union fell. Many countries there became democratic, became capitalist, and it was very productive for them. And they had great wealth and human rights increased. So why wouldn't that happen in Iraq? Why wouldn't Afghanistan want that?
Right. You talked about how dissonance was one of the things that gave you the epiphany to get into the army. And then it feels like you're also describing this dissonance between expectation versus reality while you're there. Did you find that while you were there, because I know you had a major shift where you were conservative and you kind of got disillusioned enough with the army that I think you later became liberal and stuff as well. What was that experience like of being kind of like disillusioned from your romanticization of the army?
I would say I'm pretty conservative, but I have the benefit now of knowing where conservative ideas are flawed. So when I first got back, you were talking about cognitive dissonance, like when your beliefs are shaken, you tend to like become nihilistic and start to think that, oh, well, if I was wrong about that, I was probably wrong about everything. What could I possibly be right about? But then over the years, I matured a little bit, I like to think, and now I've realized I've come to a point, if we're going to talk about politics, which comes to a point where I feel like you kind of need conservatives and you need liberals, and the democracy is working best when it's healthy, when they're working together and give and take. So that's kind of what I came to with you
view it as like the yin and yang.
Yeah.
So you realize like it sounds like you're less partisan now, whereas when you grew up, you're like, yeah, Bush, like really just sold into the conservative dream. Whereas now you're like, yeah, I value conservative stuff. I tend to fall conservative, but I'm not like sold into the pipe dream and realize it's like the only way.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how I would explain it.
And would you say that was your military experience that caused that shift specifically for you?
Yeah, for sure. Once I realized that it wasn't good, that we would go kick in doors at night where I'm pointing guns at families at 3 a.m. and shouting at them and asking like, where's your, trying to find their dad because he's a bomb maker. And I'm bringing them back to the police station and then hearing them get tortured at night by the Iraqis, not us. But I start to think like, wait a second, maybe this isn't a good idea.
Yeah.
After you come back, you spend a little bit of time, I guess, personally growing, thinking, and then somehow, how do you get back into becoming interested in military-related stuff, and then wanting to dive into the bureaucracies of things and kind of reapproach it from a different lens?
Once I started working at Task and Purpose, when I saw there was like this job opportunity for a place called Task and Purpose and they cover military stuff, I was like, well, I was in the military and they want somebody who knows film and video. So I thought, this seems like it could be a really good fit. Because I'd worked in TV. I worked at The Daily Show with Jon Stewart for a little bit. And then I worked in corporate America doing basically commercials for like Cisco and IBM. And it wasn't fulfilling.
When you're working in those worlds, just real quick, because you mentioned working for Jon Stewart behind the scenes, does it feel weird, or did anybody ever treat you differently or know that you had like a military background? Because I feel like, especially as somebody that grew up watching a lot of Jon Stewart, the perceptions of the military, we have like serious Iraq war trauma, and it was very negative. Did you ever feel any of that? Would people talk to you? Or
I got a couple points for that.
Yeah.
So the only reason I got a job there was because I was in the military.
Okay.
I was basically a diversity hire for military wise.
Yeah.
And
which we need more of in media, especially because oh my God, there are articles written where it's like you guys have nobody on staff that does. Yeah, but sorry. Yeah.
No, totally. You're absolutely right.
Is that what you were there for? Is like the military like advice to be like, hey?
No,
or you just an intern? You were a diversity hire. You were the intern.
So a lot of people don't know this, but like Jon Stewart is actually a huge supporter of the military. He never talks about this stuff because that's not why he does it. He does it not for attention, but he quietly visited pretty much every single wounded soldier. He would go to Walter Reed Hospital, and guys I knew that got wounded, he would go visit them and joke around with them, treat them normal. And he just had, even though you hear him on TV and he's ripping the war apart, but personally, huge supporter of the military. So when they found out that I was a veteran, they were like, I think that's why they never would have hired me probably, because it's like 1 in a million.
But minor grievance. I feel like in the United States, conservatives for a long time would try, it's a little political, but conservatives would try to attract liberals saying that like, you don't support the troops. That was a big one.
Yep.
And liberals would usually say, well, no, we support the troops, you just don't support the war. And Jon Stewart's a New Yorker, so right, because he's already built a little bit different.
New Jersey.
What?
New Jersey, but yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah. Same
Half the people that live in New Jersey just go work there.
You're right.
But,
this feels like a very esoteric point.
No, but
okay, sure.
but man, it really does feel like today I don't know if it's just a social media or what. It really does feel like there's a lot more demonization of the individual military aspects, like the individual like units, soldiers, rather than just like a criticism of the entire apparatus. Like before, it would have been like we're criticizing the war, not the troops, and now it's like you work for Raytheon, you work for Lockheed, you work for Boeing. Like just the fact that you even work at those companies makes you an evil person, let alone soldiers, let alone anybody doing military decisions.
That's interesting. Do you think I don't know that people are out for they don't hate people that are in the military today. And maybe TikTok has turned them, but I do feel like you're right about people who work for defense companies.
Do you feel like there's less individual respect? Because I feel like when I was growing up, like again, Canadian watching American, there was like if you found out somebody was a soldier, you'd always thank them for their service. Like it was a really big like respect thing.
That depends on where you're at too.
Yeah. Is that still pervasive though? Like
the respect?
Yeah.
Yeah, you get a lot of thank you for your service. You get a lot of that. Unless there was, so since I was in the National Guard, I also did some domestic deployments. And you see how differently people treat you when you're on hurricane duty and people haven't had gas for 3 days and they're telling you to fuck off because you can't help them. But other than that, people very supportive of the military, I feel like, in the U.S.
Okay, so you haven't noticed this shift away from not supporting the war, but supporting the individual still, which is
that could be environments we live in too. The world of the political that I inhabit is actual AIDS.
It's possible. So. I don't know. I don't know.
You talked about diversity hire for Jon Stewart.
Being conservative there. So I never really brought it up. I was an intern. I was like cutting apples and getting coffee. I wasn't writing the show, but. So I wouldn't ever really bring it up. I would hear I love the way he did the show, but like I would disagree with pretty much everything he would say. Sure. And sometimes I'd be like, oh, he's being unfair or he's so biased, not realizing that you have to build an audience, and the way you build an audience is with a perspective. I get that now, but no, people treated me very well. Yeah.
Okay. And then from there, basically, you found the job at Task and Purpose, and then since then it's been...
So, started off pretty much as an editor there, just behind the scenes, not doing any on-camera stuff. And I just sort of saw that YouTube... Like, why aren't we posting these videos on YouTube? And I had some people there were very supportive. Patrick Baker was extremely helpful, and he was just like, dude, if you... see an opportunity and you want to post videos on there, they were like, do it. And Zach Iskell, the CEO of Task and Purpose at the time, he's also the guy that helped stand up Marine Special Forces. They were extremely supportive of I had these ambitions of like, we could make this YouTube thing work. And so I started getting over my I was very uncomfortable with like being on camera, or I was also very terrible at kind of presenting stuff at first.
Really?
So
even though you went to film school, so you must have just done the back end at film school.
All behind the camera stuff. Yeah. So once there, I just started getting into. Basically, I was covering it in a funny way. I was trying to make these jokey, silly videos about the military, and people would comment and they'd say, "Hey, why don't you tell us something actually valuable about the BTR Russian vehicle instead of just making a joke about it and making this satirical video about the BTR? Tell us what is it capable of?" And that kind of clicked when I saw that hate comment. It wasn't articulated quite that way. It was like, F you're not funny. Like, why are you doing this?
Yeah, there's a little extra flavor there.
Right.
Yeah, gotcha.
So I read in between the lines, and I got the kind of the feedback that like your mom won't give you about your work. And I saw, okay, maybe I should look deeper into this, and started researching about its armor specifications. And then that takes you down a rabbit hole of like the history behind the whole development. And kind of from there just started presenting the videos, and it grew. It just kind of blew up.
One more random thing relating to service and then getting into this. Is there anything that you study from the bureaucratic side where when you were a grunt, you were like, I hate this, it's so stupid, I would change this is so dumb, and then looking at it from the bureaucratic side, you're like, oh, here's this thing that was really obnoxious and annoying to me, but now looking at it from this end, I understand why it has to be this way.
Yes, there's so many times where when you're a cog in the machine, you don't appreciate the machine. Like when we would be sitting there, for instance, it really is true that war is boring a lot of the times, and you seeing the logistics side of it, you're like, why are we wasting the amount of waste we would save, just millions of dollars worth of fuel, or like, why are we stationed here for 11 days and then we just go there to only come back here to be here for 11 days before we can get a transport helicopter to fly us out there? And the whole time you're just like, this is so inefficient. But now looking at how the Army does this, from a stand back point of view, you realize it's nothing short of a miracle that the U.S. military was able to project power in a country halfway around the world with 100,000 people. Like,
I was going to say, you brought this up earlier relating to the Russian prep, and a common talking point is like, we waste so much money in the military. Like, do we really need to do these training exercises every year? Like, it seems like this is like a huge, like, you were just setting piles of cash on fire. And man, if you compare the first couple of months of the U.S. invading Iraq, and you compare that to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can see the difference in having a prepared military forces that's ready to, project power. Even these phrases mean like project power. What is that? Like the idea of moving so many tens of thousands of soldiers in an area where you're feeding them, you're supplying them, they're combat ready. They're like, you have like all your disciplines working from your, there's a term that Ryan McBeth really likes to use, but when you're combining like your air, land and sea and everything, and you're
combined arms warfare.
I think combined arms warfare.
And Ryan McBeth is amazing. By the way. People should check him out. He's on YouTube and Substack.
You could definitely see the importance of being able to do that. And the United States doesn't I am not aware in our recent history at all, where regardless of how you feel about our political aims, the military aims are generally pretty, like, if there's a mission, it'll get done.
It's incredible. People, for the last 10 years, I feel like I heard people saying, oh, you guys got your ass kicked by, the Taliban and the Iraqi insurgency handed it to you. And I feel as though kind of the war in Ukraine a little bit vindicated the fact that on the tactical picture, the tactical end, the actual combat side of things, we wiped the floor. Mm-hmm. We won those wars in terms of the battlefield. I don't think anyone would argue that. Like, Russia's losing thousands and thousands of soldiers. We lost in total, I think it was 5,000 across 2 wars across over 20 years. Like, you don't get to invade 2 countries and topple their governments and then leave and kind of not be held accountable for any of it. Like, and then I don't think we lost those wars.
Sure.
Like, strategically, geopolitically, but on the battle aspect of it, the power projection aspect of it, being able to sustain forces for years and years on end, the United States sent a clear message what we were capable of.
What do you think shifted for the states that it's like military became, like, I mean, it's unquestionable that the United States military is just like leagues ahead of almost everything on the planet and has been for decades. What do you think was like that shift? Like, was it our military principle? Was it our philosophy? Was it our bureaucracy and logistics? Like, what made us just launch so far ahead of other countries?
There's a popular meme that I like that goes around the internet, and it says, our enemies are about to find out why we don't have healthcare. And I think part of the reason why we wipe the floor militarily is because we spend an enormous amount. And not just that we spend an enormous amount on defense. And I'm not a policymaker. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but just we do. And we've done it for decades. So they have to catch up. They're spending so much less that they now they're generations behind in terms of technology.
Right. Is there like major differences though that you see in like American military like philosophy that you think helps it stand ahead as well? Like, I just think about like the level of like discipline that can exist within the military.
Yes.
There's a good answer for this.
What
is it? I'm curious what your answer is. I want to hear your answer. I have a strong opinion about this. Go for it.
My theory is that the United States I look at it from your regular soldier's point of view, is we let our NCOs, we let our sergeants basically have a lot of initiative. We don't do as much top down. We let the bottom up organization. That's how at least our army runs. So that gives us a huge advantage, I feel like.
Okay. I feel similarly.
Is that the right answer?
I'm a huge simp for liberal democracy, not liberal conservative, but just liberal, like the idea behind our style of government and the way that we organize our political system. And I think that's a big reason why, especially, I know more about like Middle Eastern stuff, but when you look at how a lot of those armies function, where it's friends of friends, where it's people that have been doing military forever, and then they have their, children do the military, and you compare how they organize stuff versus our way more rigid way of promoting people and training people and everything. I feel like democracies are more responsive in general to those types of pressures rather than places that promote more along like family lines, or places that are more dictatorial, where your lower people can't operate freely because if they report the wrong thing, they're going to get fired, and they might be encouraged to misreport or misrepresent or steal money or whatever. I feel like our style of government and our concept of how the country operates, I think, plays a lot into how our military expresses itself.
It does. It's funny how human nature can be reflected in these systems from the top down, where you see democratic countries, there are pros and cons.
Yeah.
Like authoritarian countries have some pros. They can move quicker sometimes. They don't have to pool their opinions. They don't have to get together and be like, hey, how does everybody feel about this?
Right.
And they don't get outlasted by asymmetrical warfare either. You're like, oh, well, you want to sit here and do this all day? Well, fine, I will sit here and do this today. Whereas in the United States, it's like, well, I've got an election next year.
Yeah.
You need to be done, okay? Because I'm going to lose my fucking president.
So to some degree, they do a little bit have to worry about...
Well, they have to worry about getting couped and assassinated,
Right.
yeah.
So like,
but they have a little bit more
below
leeway
that
there.
threshold of a coup or a revolution, like everything below that, you're right. They can kind of.
Could you imagine a U.S. president trying to sell the population like, okay, it's not the Iraq War, this is the Iraq Special Military Operation, guys. Okay, so you can't actually hold me. Yeah, it just wouldn't work. Yeah.
Right. So there are pros and cons. So about the authoritarian, I'd like to at some point we should get into the axis of resistance, like Iran, China, North Korea. And did I miss another one?
Russia?
North Korea, China, Russia.
Okay.
Yeah, they're the axis of resistance right now.
North Korea, China, Russia. Do you factor Iran as part of this one?
Yeah.
North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. Okay.
Yeah. So those are the main cats. They're the main players right now who are pushing against U.S.
hegemony.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So they're using like you said, they can kind of just say, hey, by the way, we're now all supporting the war effort for Russia against Ukraine, and there isn't going to be months of delay in aid. North Korea sent 3 million artillery shells to Ukraine, to Russia, to use against Ukraine. Yeah. They sent them there in a way.
Yeah.
They put them on like 6,000 containers and shipped them over. You got Iran sent 300,000 artillery shells plus drones, and China is essentially sending an aid package by buying cheap oil, supporting their war effort, and also sending machine tools and sending cotton. A lot of people don't know this, but cotton is one of the most important ingredients in how to create artillery, which everyone knows is a major artillery shortage right now. Okay. Artillery shells. So all those.
What does the cotton do?
Yeah, I had no idea about the cotton.
It's called gun cotton, and you need it to make.
Like pack the artillery together, or
it's one of the components in explosives.
Okay.
It's like a type of gunpowder is made out of cotton.
Okay. Take your word for it.
So Kazakhstan and I believe Uzbekistan, they're neutral in the war, but they're the
shipping
Turkey and China are the main suppliers of cotton to Russia, and China is cutting off their supply of cotton to Europe, who wants it so that they can. And maybe I get the type of cotton wrong. It's called nitrocellulose, I believe. It's the type of cotton that they're trying to procure.
Has Turkey been supplying Russia through the war with the material?
So they get around the sanctions by saying that it's dual use. You can have civilian purposes for it. It can be used for varnish,
like textiles,
paint. Yeah,
and
exactly.
Stuff like that,
yeah.
Okay. So those and sometimes it's not like I'm blaming them or something. There's a million factors that go into why these countries do this, but
for Turkey, it's because it makes the money. Same reason they were buying oil from ISIS. It makes the money.
Could be. They what you see is this axis of resistance getting together and supporting Russia, and then you have democracies have a little bit more trouble getting on the same page. They have to get not just their leaders but their people
It's like we're seeing right now, so many people just don't want to keep spending money on Ukraine and sending them weapons and stuff, which is leading to weapons crisis. And
right. And I'm sympathetic to that. I get that. They feel like they a little bit have been batted around. They're like, didn't we just do this? We just did Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. Like, what, you're selling me another forever war? I get that point of view. I'm sympathetic to that. And I think that it's a good thing that people can get together here and debate that, and that's part of the process.
It has to be
slower.
Yeah, the analysis has to be more sophisticated, though, than all wars are bad.
Yeah.
I really feel like the residual trauma from Iraq has like rendered us unable to reasonably evaluate any sort of foreign intervention. I can't imagine you're a Ukrainian and you're, not sure if you're going to be doing your military offensive or not, and it's being held up because in the United States, apparently there are a lot of people illegally immigrating from the South, and somehow your funding for your artillery shells is going to depend on whether or not Donald Trump, who's not president, tells people in their Congress to not pass a bill that would include funding for that. But it's got to be an unbelievably annoying process to be a foreign citizen relying on American aid, having to deal with the schizophrenia that America has right now with our internal political system. I feel like our inability to stand together at home and then project a united nation in any conflict, and how divided we are on those conflicts, is incredibly damaging to U.S. soft and hard projection around the world. Like Ukraine, Israel, and China all feel like very, very, very political issues. And if you were, I think Angela Merkel honestly said it accurately, that the U.S. is like fading. She said something in regards to like the U.S. can't be seen as a leader in world affairs because it feels like we're like anything could happen. Like if Trump or Biden wins, it feels like the directions we could take foreign policy wise could be incredibly different. And I don't know how you rely on a partner like that internationally if they're supposed to be funding you or supporting you.
I think Trump would do the same thing that Biden's doing. I don't think there would be that big of a change. I think he says, I don't. I think he says that, I'll stop funding to Ukraine. Are you kidding me? He says, I'm sure you saw him do this during his first term. He'll say something outrageous.
Yeah. I mean, all politicians
and then
do
he'll
this to some extent,
walk it back 6 levels. Like, there's no way. We're investing $3 billion a year now into ramping up our artillery production to 100,000 shells a month by the end of this year. Like, Donald Trump is not going to come in and then just reverse all that and be like, by the way, all this insane investment that we've been doing and planning for, like, it's just going to stop. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say he's not. I just think it's unlikely.
Yeah, I don't want to dig you down too deep into the political hole. I guess the only scary thing is that I know there are a lot of criticisms for career politicians, and I understand that, and I'm very sympathetic towards that. But at the very least, I can kind of track their opinions through time. I have a rough idea maybe of where things are going. I feel like it's a bit more difficult to predict with Trump because it's like, say Obama signs a deal with Iran to monitor nuclear stuff, and then the next president comes in and it's like, nope, we're not doing that anymore. Or we've got like historic meetings with Kim in North Korea, and then nothing comes from that. And then we've got like, we're changing the way that we are like monitoring drone strikes in Yemen. And it's like, well, fuck. Like when you ask me, like, would Donald Trump not fund Ukraine anymore? I tend to agree. I don't think that would happen, but I feel like he's more sensitive to changing political winds, and I don't feel like I couldn't see. I'm loading this politically a lot.
No,
I really
go
don't
ahead. Go.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear what you say.
I feel like Donald Trump is very personally driven, and I couldn't see him going to bat for an issue unless he felt like he had kind of like the political support for it. Like if his party, or if the wind started to change a bit for his people, and they were like, oh, we don't know if we like Ukraine anymore, I could easily see that we should be supporting America first. It's time for Ukraine to like settle for peace, and like we need to be ready to move into the future. I could see him just doing that and abandoning it.
He's
Right.
like almost missing that career politician where we like put out that aesthetic of this is what I'm going to do, but underneath it, there's this like consistent bureaucracy that we always do.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it's a possibility. Maybe he would. I don't think so. I think what we're talking about right now, though, is one of the weaknesses of democracy. Yeah. It's like one of the downsides, or you could at least look at it that way. Maybe it also has a strength, but the fact that it kind of ping pongs so heavily, it's a problem. You don't see that in Iran. They're not suddenly changing their position the next day. Yeah, I don't think it'd be so hard to change. Like with Russia, for instance, Trump seemed very pro-Russia. Meanwhile, he put one of the most anti-Russian CIA heads and was in office during one of the biggest buildups of the CIA in Ukraine. Like if he just doesn't do a lot of the things that he says he's going to do.
Yeah. I think the people whispering in his ear are very important because it feels like sometimes he'll do whatever the last person told him to do, or that'll kind of be where his opinions are. I don't think there would be like a historic breaking, but it's hard to know. And the fact that I'm not sure is like the scary thing, I think. Yeah.
The America First thing is interesting though, because like you said, I do feel like Iraq was one of the biggest reasons why, like, we had all this political capital, we had all of this world standing, and we kind of just blew it. We like shot it all on Iraq. And then now everyone is so kind of skeptical of when something comes up that possibly could really be the right thing
worthy,
to do.
Noble,
Right.
yeah.
Like Ukraine, right? That's important to do, but it's hard to like keep the energy up for it because people are so brain rotted over.
And then I see like historical rewritings too that are irritating because now I have even people, and again, I fully admit I might be totally online brained in different circles or whatever, like people even question the legitimacy of like the first Gulf War. Like, was it the US place to go in and do this? Or, should we have even, why don't we like Assad? Like, is that really, did he actually do any of this stuff? And like, but regime change in Israel now is apparently the most important thing on the left, but it wasn't for Gaddafi. It wasn't for Assad. It wasn't for Saddam Hussein. It's not for the Houthis. It's like, I hate the political situation. When you're looking at, or actually, here's a quick random question for military stuff, because this comes up a lot. Do people talk politics in the military, or do people mostly just whatever?
It depends, I guess, on what part of the you're saying in the units. Do the regular Joes talk about it?
Yeah.
Surprisingly not.
Okay.
No, the military, when you look at it, is pretty 50-50 in terms of conservative and liberal. Yeah, and the guys in the barracks, like, they weren't all rah conservative, and they weren't super liberal either.
I think this needs to be brought up more because I asked you before loading that at all, because that's what I've heard from every single person that's done any military service. People, general Americans, or at least people on the left, actually I think people on the right too, have this impression that if you were to walk into a barracks, it's going to be like Make America Great hats on everywhere. There's going to be Trump speeches in the background, that like everybody working in intelligence, like these people are super politicized. And when I talk to people that work in intelligence and military service, whatever, they're usually like, nobody really talks politics much here at all. That's an answer that I get really consistently.
And it's really politically diverse, which is interesting because I feel like the thing I always hear about American military is that they're all conservative. They always vote for Republican. Always. They would never not vote for Republican. It's a Republican military bind, but that's just not the case.
And a lot of them are kind of independent thinkers too. Like they wouldn't entirely be one way or the other way. Yeah. No, it's well documented, actually. They've done studies. It's 50-50.
Interesting.
Okay, going back to the for the broad macro scene. Do you feel like the United States would have more success doing foreign policy if we were a bit more like honest to our citizens about what our foreign policy means? Because I feel like, especially in the Iraq era, when we sell foreign policy to U.S. citizens, it's just kind of using it's just the words freedom and democracy, and that's basically it. And I feel like veering away from that and saying anything different feels like a bad thing. But I feel like you could make very strong arguments for why supporting U.S. interests abroad not only helps us in the United States, but can help the people there and can help people around the world. And I feel like we're very, I don't want to say dishonest, but I feel like we couch our language a lot in terms of leadership. Yeah, do you think that messaging would matter?
It would take the right person.
Okay.
It would take a really good communicator to do that, because I think there's reasons why the State Department communicates foreign policy in that way. It's run through hundreds of focus groups, I'm sure. I think that messaging is what resonates with the most people, and in saying the quiet part out loud, that kind of thing, it feels like that's what we should be doing, and that maybe that would be more effective. But I think if you want to appeal, when you're thinking about talking to 330 million Americans, you need to appeal
to as many of them as possible.
Yes, with a message that will appeal to as many people as possible. And saying we need to invest in our interests overseas because if Ukraine's taken over, then it's going to cost us even more money. And if we start losing influence, and the dollar starts shaking, then this will hit your pocketbook, and your tax money that we're spending to support Ukraine right now will be nothing compared to what will happen if they take over Ukraine. That's a harder message to sell, I think.
It is harder. One thing that I worry, this is very political, direction. But one thing that is kind of frustrated me with the U.S. political system is I feel like we have used so much shorthand to explain what we're doing, whether we're talking domestically or internationally, that the shorthand is like taken over and destroyed our ability to actually evaluate fundamentally why we do a particular thing. So that might be, it sounds silly, but like, should women be able to vote? Like, I feel like people don't know the answer to that question anymore. So then you see in smaller spaces, like these people have like repeal the 19th Amendment, or why do we have, civil rights, or why do we have protected classes, or why do we have foreign policy aims that we do?
Why does our military spending matter?
Yeah, why do we waste so much money on the military? I'm sure you've heard this a billion times. Why do we waste so much money on the military? It's so stupid. And there are aspects of U.S. foreign policy that I think are really good and really cool. Like, if there are people that are shooting weapons into boats in the ocean, I like that the United States can sail the Navy over to Yemen and say, we're going to sit here next to these ships, and if you shoot anything, we're going to obliterate you with high precision. Unless something has changed, I don't believe any civilians were killed in any of the Yemen installation bombings, right? When the
U.S. government probably hasn't said that any have.
I don't think the Houthis said that they had, have they?
I
You don't want to? Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't recall any of those, but I think that those
they didn't target any. They targeted places that were ammo depots in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So
there's value in that.
And like, who else is doing that? China didn't come and help resolve that.
I'm not even sure if China's Navy can make it that far yet.
They have a naval base in Djibouti right over there, so they could have helped out, but they're not going to do that. They don't want to be seen helping
firing
the United
weapons
States
because they're already trying
kind of
to
on
like
the axis of resistance, and Yemen's kind of falling into that, right?
Well, also trying to gain influence in too, because I think they were trying to broker deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they want to.
So to go back to, I do think it's a good thing that we question how much we spend on the military. I do think that it's natural to question why are we spending, I think it's $1 trillion now, when there's many people who are homeless and starving. Not that putting money into that would fix that problem. As we've learned, California dumps tons of money into their homeless problem and it doesn't solve it. But it's good that democracies, that we can have a sober discussion about like, hey, is this the right thing to spend this much money on? Yeah. Should maybe our allies spend more on defense so that they can take a piece of that responsibility? I mean,
what do you think on that? I'm super curious, actually.
I think it's a good thing. I think countries should be more self-sufficient in their defense spending.
So you want other countries to spend more, and do you feel that we overspend?
I think they want to as well. I think it's difficult for them to make those changes in their budget. Poland is doing it. If you guys want to talk about the defense modernization programs of these different countries like Poland and Germany and France, and Britain, they're increasing their defense spending by billions of dollars, all of them now, because they're all spooked out. So yeah, I think it's good for them to spend more on defense, and maybe it would be good for the United States to be able to lower how much they spend on defense. That would be nice. Sure. Maybe right now they can't.
I guess my concern is that like when we have that conversation, it has to be done with the fundamental goals in mind, because if the fundamental goals are misunderstood, then I think that the conversation veers into dumb places. Like if the United States spends money on our military because we just enjoy bombing people overseas and so that we can pay for these corrupt military industrial complex organizations to make a lot of money, we should cut our military spending by 90%. Why would we spend any money on it, right?
What are our fundamental goals?
What
are our fundamental goals? What should they be?
Yeah, I mean, like being able to project power to guarantee trade routes is it's one of those things where it's like you don't need your immune system when you're not sick,
right?
But if you don't have it, you're dead, right? Yeah. And I think that people don't know what the world looks like without somebody guaranteeing passages for free trade. It's the ability to. It's one thing that people don't understand too is the ability to leverage allies. So for instance, people think that it's bad that whether you think it's good or bad that the United States supports Israel, supporting somebody means that you have more say in what they do. And just being supportive of somebody means you can also tell them to like, hey, like slow down a little bit, like calm down, like, or we're not going to support you. And if we have that hand, we have that control. Being able to project these things internationally, I think is really important, and it's also important because there's very much like a game theory element where if you don't do it, somebody else will. And if the United States wants to say, we're going to be better than this, and we're not going to support, before we even finish that sentence, Russia and China is like, okay, well, we'll support them.
We'll do it, yeah.
Well, absolutely.
That's what we're
organize
seeing
that
happening, I
piece.
think.
Yeah,
I think
is
a
the
little
fighting-
bit, we saw the
China
United
moving in
States...
with Ukraine and Russia a little bit.
After
Yeah.
the United States went to Iraq and Afghanistan and pulled back and started sort of pulling off the world stage, you see China and Russia sort of filling vacuums. It's concerning. For one, personally, I think I hear that argument all the time. That people will say, like, why do we spend so much on defense? And that there's a concern that the military-industrial complex is pulling the strings, and that we have this perverse incentive to keep war going on forever.
Right.
Okay, I get that argument, valid, but you also kind of have to explain away the fact, it's a valid concern.
It's just politicians can't get elected on the back of dead soldiers. But yeah, sorry.
It's a valid concern, but I don't believe that we're at that point yet, because you'd have to explain the fact that why has U.S. military spending gone down several times over the last several decades. Since World War II, we've steadily decreased our spending in terms of a percentage of our GDP. So how do you explain that? If the military-industrial complex is truly keeping us at war all of the time, and there are arguments for it, how do you explain that there isn't more war, and that more of the budget isn't going to defense? There's been times where we have cut defense, slashed it, and cut troop numbers. So
I think my biggest pet peeve with that argument, and people don't go too deep into it because whatever, but like when you look at the actual size of these companies, the revenue that they're doing, it's dwarfed like several times over, like orders of magnitude, when you look at like our tech industry. And when like military conflict and stuff happens around the world and like energy prices are affected, everything, like if you were thinking that people were pulling the strings behind the economy of the United States, I would be looking at people like Apple and Facebook and Amazon, because these guys, their advertising budgets could account for the entire profit of like the entire military industrial complex. So the idea that a few companies with market caps of anywhere from 10 to 100 billion are pulling the strings, meanwhile Apple is sitting here with bank accounts larger than like the yearly revenue of like multiple of these companies combined, it drives me crazy.
Yeah.
And it ignores all of the other pressures for why we get involved, sometimes bad and sometimes good, with foreign conflicts as well. I think my biggest frustration with people that make bad arguments is that I think there are good arguments to be made against things sometimes, but we can't even get into those because there are so many dumb ones that you have to chew through first, and they can provide cover or legitimacy to one side, or they just hijack the conversations and then nothing happens at all.
There's also the argument that we're not spending enough on defense, and you see the disrepair that our Navy is in, the disrepair that some of our military... So a lot of our equipment is from the 1970s. We're still using the same platforms. The M2 Bradley from the 1970s, the M1 Abrams from the 70s. Like, there's an argument to be made that we need to spend more on defense.
I had a couple cop friends that would complain to me on the BLM era when they would see videos of the cops and some of these like kitted AR-15s that these guys have, and they're like, holy shit, this guy's like rifle is more than like the cost of my entire gear issue to me or whatever. Is like, yeah, the insane amount of spending for some of our police forces versus what, and they even buy shit from the military sometimes too, versus like what the military guys will get. Yeah, there's
a program where they can get a lot of that
at discount.
Decommissioned.
Oh,
that's
and
how you
it's
see
cheaper,
the armored
I'm guessing, right?
vehicles and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna.
Oh, yeah, go.
I have a question actually about China and Taiwan. So do you have stuff on that's not a derail?
Stuff relating to that? No, go for it.
Okay, so you said we should probably get into the axis of resistance. I know we've dug into it a little bit. Last time when Ryan was here, he said that he thinks China is going to invade Taiwan probably in the next like year or two. I'm super curious on your thoughts of that. Do you think that the tensions are at the point that China would be invading and kind of surrounding and going into Taiwan?
Yeah, actually, I think I listened to that talk that you had with Ryan. He was very insightful analysis that he added to that. And there was something that he brought up that I want to put a pin in about the Israel-Gaza incident. He was talking about, when I was talking to him briefly, he mentioned the Sons of Palestine, this idea of like, oh, maybe we could invest in a militia force inside Palestine to help to give them money, kind of like similar to what we did in Iraq.
What you're talking about with that,
But sorry. So with
I'll write that
with
down.
what the point that you guys were talking about with Taiwan.
Yeah.
He was mentioning that there's a possibility that they could do something like a limited strike.
Yeah.
Like with ballistic missiles, like what we saw with Iran, what they recently did, which we could talk about that too. It's fascinating. But I do think that there's a threat. There's a chance. Is it high, or is it likely or unlikely? That's kind of the multi-billion-dollar question that the intelligence agencies are working on right now. They're trying to figure out what is China's intentions. I think what Ryan said is a likely scenario, that they do some kind of something just below the threshold of a full-on war. I don't know that it's in their interest to launch a full invasion,
Right.
like how we saw with Ukraine. I don't know if that plays to the, they might take an island here or there in the Spratly Islands. They might take one of those, one of the disputed islands in the Philippines. There's a lot of steps basically that they can take on the escalation ladder, short of, okay, we're going to mass 1.5 million troops and we're going to put them on amphibious assault vehicles, and we're going to spin up our civilian. There's this third sea force in China where, we have the Coast Guard and we have the Navy. Mm-hmm. They have the Coast Guard and the Navy, and then they have a civilian militia force of shipping vessels that are like fishing vessels that have weapons on them as well.
Which is why Chinese fishermen have been getting killed by Taiwanese people. Is that the connection
there? There
Because I know that's
are
been happening
instances where they're ramming each other with boats, and you've probably seen where you had the water cannons on each other. Yeah, there's
a whole meta game behind boats that do international anything, like fishing or whatever, where they have all these like fences they put up, the water cannons to prevent like pirates. That seems incredibly stressful. Holy shit.
It's crazy what's happening right now in the South China Sea. And so the Philippines there's a couple of the countries in this area have kind of made a decision already if they're going to ally with us, if they're going to ally with China, if they're going to be neutral. Indonesia, for instance, they're playing the neutral game. They've done that since the first Cold War, because I feel like we're in a second one now. But Taiwan is, what we're doing basically is we're doing a porcupine strategy. We're trying to send them billions of dollars worth of missiles and aircraft to basically to deter China, to make the cost of invading so high that they decide not to. And we would know months in advance if they were going to, right. Similar to how Ukraine, we saw them lined up and doing training exercises. Mm-hmm. We would see them line up on their shores and satellite imagery months in advance. And there's only I believe it's 2 or 3 times a year that the weather conditions allow for an invasion, by an amphibious invasion.
Interesting. Okay.
Does that sea freeze over in the winter? Does it become?
It's not that it's. My understanding is that there's the waves and the water are not conducive to these amphibious vehicles. Are
like they just can't ground and get soldiers on land and stuff.
Okay. Do you? I guess focusing then more on this. If China were to actually invade Taiwan, I feel like the temperature on the planet is so high right now, and the United States has its hands in so many things. I feel like my worry would be biggest right now that it's when it would happen, I guess. If Ukraine and Russia, we're already fighting over whether we support that. You've obviously got issues between Israel, Palestine, and supporting that. If China were to do something, I understand there's escalatory steps. I'm not saying a full-on invasion, but it feels like it would be really hard to garner domestic support for any sort of, because, oh, wow, we're going to China now too. Like, who else are we going to go to war with? Who else are we going to defend? I worry. I would worry about that.
That, I think, is something that the American people are pretty, if I remember the polls correctly, they're more kind of down for that.
Sure.
Like, for some reason, not as much supportive of the war in Ukraine, but a lot of people appear to be, they understand kind of the threat that China poses. And we were talking about, if the United States shrinks away from this world leadership position, like, who's going to fill it? Yeah. Well, do we want the world to look more like how China runs things? Do we want their authoritarian flavor?
As much as I hate to say it, I think I tweeted this out. I miss my neocons a little bit. I agree with what you were saying earlier, that having different people are good to fight with each other, because the tension is the important part, but we arrive at, I think, realistic political truths. And now that we have no more neocons, I think the left has always been, I say a tad more dovish, but I guess we had Syria and Libya under Obama, so for as dovish as that is, but the right was usually kind of like our more militant, like, we need to go do this, we need to go fight. And now under Trump, they feel a lot more isolationist, like, well, America first, let them deal with their stuff. So you don't have that big push from there anymore. The far left, obviously, like kids at school and social media, don't want to do anything foreign policy-wise. So then you kind of have like your center left, like your older liberals who are kind of like looking around, who are like, well, we used to be known for just like, I guess, fighting for gay marriage, and now we're also have to defend, aggressive U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. political landscape has changed so much. And then when you talk about like,
so you don't see like a yin and yang anymore?
It's flipped. When I was growing up, the conservatives you would have thought they were saying what you're hearing the liberal side say now.
I mentioned my mom was Cuban. Both my parents were in the Air Force. I heard so much crazy stuff about the Chi-Coms and Russia. I don't know if my mom ever called them Russia. I think she would always just say the Soviet Union and Putin, the KGB thug. And to hear even my parents today be like, well, I don't know if we should be supporting Ukraine, or I don't know if we should do this, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, if this was under Bush, my mom and dad would be like, don't even bring him back from Iraq. Our soldiers should go right up to Ukraine afterwards. And they should be marching to Moscow. We need to end what we should have in 91. We need to take them out completely. And it's like, yeah, the opinions on that flipped so quickly, so violently. I was not expecting that or ready for that.
So do you feel like, do you feel like there's no yin and yang, that like what Chris has described is like kind of like the American two-party system, which is like you guys have this tension between the liberal and the conservative, and you kind of keep each other in check? Are you saying because the factions are so spread out,
there is no yin and yang. Now it's like yin and like tick, from like yin and yang and tic-tac-toe. We're like in totally different worlds. To bring it on back to the China-Taiwan thing, though, the worry that I have when so many conflicts are happening is, I wouldn't say right now, everybody's like, World War III, World War III. And I don't think we're on a path to World War III, because I think that all the parties involved so far are operating like they don't want World War III. I think that Russia at least is like, when they move their weapons, they saber rattle, but everybody can see them. Iran was like, while the missiles were leaving, they were like, we're done, we promise we're not attacking anymore. And then when Israel counterattacked, Iran was like, well, we didn't actually see that. And it feels like people are trying to be responsible. But especially like if conflict happens in China, my worry is that like the temperature is being turned up in so many different regions that it's like the pullout in Afghanistan, that like it only takes one really bad attack where it's like 200 soldiers are dead, where it's like now everything changes domestically, foreign policy wise. And I guess that's really scary to me, that a bad attack in a certain area could cause the U.S. opinion to hardcore swing in one direction or the other. And then, everything changes for the worse. Yeah.
If you're talking about the possibility of World War III happening, I think it's getting more likely. Mm-hmm. I could see it happening.
Or even not that, like, the thing is, I could see it going either way, where it's like either World War III, or it's like the United States' population is just like, we're actually totally done with like military stuff. I don't want to support anything anymore. Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's possible. Mm-hmm. I don't know. A lot of times the American people, like, it's hard to put ourselves into that mindset of how we would think, but I do believe that what you would see is a little bit of that post 9/11 patriotism. If Taiwan was attacked, I think there would be that sense of camaraderie would come back, that sense of community.
You really think so?
Back. I think it's possible.
I super disagree.
What happened 9/11 is obviously a different example, because we were attacked, but the support for Taiwan is high. The American people see China increasingly as an adversary. I'm not too worried. Plus, the United States military in that instance, it's not going to really be up to the American people if we defend Taiwan or not.
Right.
We're the leaders of the country are going to make that decision. And this has been a strong part of foreign policy for decades now. There's strategic ambiguity around whether or not we would defend Taiwan. And it's increasingly, you're seeing the foreign policy messaging is going more and more towards I
feel like it's clear that we would defend. I feel like that's what I see everywhere now.
They flat out have said it at this point. And we thought maybe it was just a gaffe, but it's becoming more clear that no, this is a change in messaging.
In the trying to see that they're doing and stuff. Yeah.
I guess the big worry is that like it took 2 years to tire us out of Ukraine, and we don't even have like soldiers there. It's been 6 months and people are, waiting on Israel. We don't have soldiers there. It feels like the appetite for any sort of like foreign stuff. But I live in like very toxic political circles. So maybe for the broader American public, maybe it's not the same.
It might be that, and that would, I think, be probably the wrong way to go.
Yeah, of course.
It would be, but also, if we're super rah and down to start World War III with China over Taiwan, is that a great thing too?
I think so.
It's
It's
you
so
have to draw the line somewhere.
I think that's the issue, is that I think like if you had a greatest foreign policy mistake from Obama, do you have an opinion on what one would be?
Well, there's the red line.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, because the issue is, when people look at like whether or not you would start World War III, they think that the starting World War III is bad, but like other people could create the conditions such that it happens. And if you constantly let them do that and you don't enforce that, in a way, you're actually, it seems counterintuitive, but you're kind of the one that's, you're the one that's doing it, you know? So I feel like at the end of the day, the United States, like, one of the big worries that I had, changing gears a little bit for Ukraine, Russia, is if you wanted to make a statement about not supporting Ukraine, and I think there are good arguments on both sides, I lean very heavily towards Ukraine, but something along the lines of like, there is no formal alliance here, it's not our obligation, we shouldn't be messing with non-aligned countries in such a hardcore way or intervening so much, fine. But the arguments are more that like, well, we could start World War III, and like, I don't know if it's a realistic, thing for them to defend themselves, and blah blah blah. The problem is every single argument that I hear used in mainstream arguments by politicians, by social media people, by pundits or whatever, would equally apply to the Baltics, would equally apply to a NATO country. Like, it's Estonia. Do we really want to risk like nuclear warfare for Latvia, for Lithuania? Like, come on, like it's bordering Russia, like it's NATO encroachment.
Taiwan.
Yeah, and that scares me.
You could see them move the goalposts that way, but I think
or wouldn't even the argument would be
NATO. I mean, NATO is an alliance, whereas Ukraine's not part of NATO.
Yeah.
So I understand their thinking there.
Well, that's why that's the argument that I could understand. That like, okay, it's a non-aligned country. I understand. I get that.
Yeah.
But the like, well, what if we start World War III and the nukes start flying? Like those could apply evenly to a NATO country too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what you would see them do. Is let's say hypothetically they take over Ukraine and then they're on the border with Poland. We would see them. They definitely would start hybrid warfare. They would start doing limited strikes. They would start testing our boundaries, essentially. And the reason I say that is because we pretty much did that to them when Ukraine was leaning towards wanting to be a part of the European Union, wanting to be a part of NATO. We were testing Russia's boundaries. We had the CIA on the border with Russia training Ukrainian special forces to attack Russian officers. So
Russian officers in the Donbass? Where they were occupied
regions.
Just to be clear on that,
Okay. Are they fair game? Yeah.
Defense of Ukrainian territory is a bit...
But the CIA themselves were saying, like, we didn't want that to happen. We didn't want them to be using our training to attack Russian forces in 2015, 2016.
But also Russian forces should have never been there.
Right, No, there's counterpoints. But what I'm saying is, like, we did that. So if Russia were to be on the border with Poland, they would do the same stuff. They'd play the same games. They'd be attacking Polish officers. Yeah. And that's not tenable. That's why I think both sides see it as a existential crisis. They see it as a non-tenable situation, both of them. It's, I think, probably likely that we see something similar to what is happening in North Korea and South Korea, or has happened on that DMZ. It's probably going to be a DMZ in Ukraine. For where that front line ends, I don't know, but that's my guess.
Do you have a strong opinion on kinetic responses to cyber warfare? Do you think that gets talked enough about? Do you think that we don't treat it seriously enough, or the military does, we don't talk about it? Or
France is investing, I think it's $5 billion extra into cyber warfare because they're one of the places that's their infrastructure is getting attacked. I hear that there's ransomware being installed into a lot of infrastructure in the United States. I don't know a ton about the cyber piece. I know that it's a part of what this massive transformation that the Army's doing. It's called multi-domain task force. Multi-domain task force. Like when I was in, it was a brigade combat team that they would deploy. Now they're changing it to multi-domain task forces, which have a cyber aspect to it.
We need a new military branch, like how Trump did the Space Force.
Cyber Force?
Cyber Force.
Unironically.
Kind of though, right?
It is a big deal.
It is.
It's not its own military branch, but there's the Cyber Command that was established. All four branches populate it.
Yeah, I'm super curious. How do you see like cyber warfare specifically impacting, like, could you see it impacting like the average infantryman, or do you think we're going to see it more like a data kind of like higher level warfare?
No, I think that'd be at a very different level than the regular soldier's picture.
Yeah.
The scary stuff is, I think, the civilian infrastructure, right? It's the idea that China can could theoretically like turn off a power plant or destroy like banking infrastructure is where like I think most of the attacks from China and Iran are usually said to be
our
focused
power
on.
grid could be brought down really quickly.
Is that what's happening in France right now?
That's what's happening, I think, in the United States to some extent.
From what I heard, there's FBI reports that China has ransomware in our electrical grid.
Or even, I don't think it's not to get political again, it's impossible not to, but a lot of the stuff relating to Hillary Clinton's campaign and the email stuff, that the hacker that penetrated the DNC and was leaking like the Podesta emails and stuff, the Guccifer guy, I'm pretty sure people don't debate it. That was like a Kremlin operative essentially, right? This was stuff coming from Russia for a lot of these hacking attacks.
Yes.
Or that spear phishing from the Guccifer hacker, and that has like significant consequences politically.
I mean,
in the United
it had
States.
A massive impact on Hillary Clinton, right?
Something that I wanted to bring up that I remember you mentioned earlier, if it's okay.
Yeah.
You were talking about the Gulf War and whether that was right or wrong. That I think is a really interesting period in. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah. It's a really interesting period because it was when the U.S. was we hadn't picture a time period when we hadn't made that mistake yet, where we hadn't kind of soured everybody to war. That was the Gulf War. And
we had the Soviet Union had collapsed. We were on top of the world.
Yeah.
The wall, Germany,
we run this shit.
Yes.
That was our moment. That was like our 15 minutes, and I feel like we kind of blew it. But I think we're seeing.
What do you mean by that?
By going into Iraq.
Because
you think the first Gulf War was a bad?
No, by going to Iraq the second time.
Okay.
I'm saying the will was blown.
What happened after that is interesting because what we started doing was a form of warfare that I think is more interesting than cyber warfare and all that. It's sanctions. We started doing sanction warfare. We started using economics as a tool of war for one of the first times against Iraq. And I think this is a little bit maybe part of the reason why we're seeing all these things happen today is the United States uses their economic weight. They throw it around. The world order that we live in today, it is so sweet for us. And I think that's why the axis of resistance is doing all of this now, is because they don't want the United States to be able to do that, to be able to hold that over their head, to be able to sanction you and basically destroy your economy just like that. We have that power. Who else has that power? Like this, I think, is why we're seeing this.
Sure, to some extent, yeah. It's kind of like earlier when I was talking about our ability to have leverage over, say, Israel because we provide them with funds. We have leverage economically over some countries being able to sanction. And it's one of the scary things about cutting all of those things off or engaging in all of those sanctions, because if you've completely released them from all of your economic grip, you've like basically unleashed them to do whatever they want.
To lose.
Like there's a lot of debate over the weaponization of SWIFT, the financial transactions when it came to Russia. And it's like, well, are we really going to start cutting people off from this? And then if we do, well, what leverage do you have for anything now? And then if you weaponize these, does it make everybody kind of like look sideways at anything relating to finances? Like it kind of feels like when credit card processors like tried to attack porn or cut off like Pornhub and stuff in the United States. It's like, how is this even happening? Like, why is my financial transaction standarditions being used because Russia is at war and now I'm like a streamer in Moscow and I can't accept PayPal anymore? And the soft power. Yeah.
Right. I'm sure you probably knew people who were streaming in Russia who just like couldn't get paid anymore. I'm guessing, but yeah, that soft power aspect of it. It's what I think how I think the world order benefits the United States so much that I think people don't understand about this world order and don't understand about if we were to lose influence around the world, what power we would be losing.
Yeah.
And how that would eventually end up coming back and hitting their pocketbook.
Yeah. Or not just looking at the pocketbook too. People are very critical about soft power weaponization. But if you don't have soft power weaponization, then you have hard power weaponization, right? So if you can't bring somebody, under your thumb through economic sanctions, well, then you bomb them.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people don't look at the alternatives, I feel like, all the time for how things could go.
Yeah. In many ways, like soft power is like the new evolution of warfare that like prevents deaths, essentially.
Kind of, yeah.
We can sanction you or we can like drop bombs on you.
I look at the progression of kind of like different world orders throughout history. I've been looking at that recently. I've also been looking at kind of how the world functions on a high level. Like for a period of time, there was imperialism, colonialism. Now there's this period of what's called neo-imperialism. Like imperialism, you would just go conquer a place, take their resources. Colonialism, you conquer, and then you send your people to live there. Neo-imperialism of today is kind of you
Use
influence.
the IMF.
Yeah, exactly. Use the IMF. You influence these places, and it's so confusing and so hard to wrap your head around. And that's why I think it's so difficult to understand how damaging it would be if the United States, when you hear, oh, we're losing influence in Africa, it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I don't care. Well, these things matter. If the empire starts to fall apart, like look at what happened to the Dutch Empire. Their currency used to be the dollar. The Dutch currency, Britain too, the UK, used to be the world currency, right? When their empire fell apart, what happened? Their currency fell apart. So like, I don't know, maybe I'm reaching.
No, wait.
It's an interesting
wait, real quick. I agree with you 100%. But I like that you looped around it, because this was my initial argument before, where I was like, I wish that we were more honest about our foreign policy ends, because of what you just said. When you don't know why we have foreign policy, like, okay, well, we're losing influence in Africa, so what? No more blood diamonds, so you can't go exploit those poor people anymore. And it's like, well, no, now they're not going to be able to trade with us. Their lives are probably going to be measurably worse. And China and Russia, man, if you think the United States exploits people poorly, like, do I have a story to tell you? You know, people will look at, you know, the U.S. and our involvement in Iraq and talk about how we killed, I think Saddam Hussein tried to claim 500,000 children because he was counting every child death or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, you brought up Chechnyan soldiers. Like, look at either of those wars. Look at Grozny, or look at Aleppo in Syria, or look at the type of warfare that these people conduct for like Russia and China. And yeah, I mean, like, the United States is not beyond reproach, but man, you're not substituting it for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. You're going to be substituting it for a power that is far more brutal and far less responsive to the complaints that you have about how other people are treated. But yeah, I like that you brought up, like, yeah, well, why does it even matter? Because people don't know. So your point is, why can't we just say that? Yeah, let's talk about it.
Why can't we just say that?
Because we exert influence in good ways too, and people don't give us credit for that. When we talked about the most hated thing in the world, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and it was horrible because it undermined labor unions and workers, and these big trade deals are bad and blah, blah, blah. My understanding is Vietnam has walked back on basically everything, but they were on the verge of so many different workers' rights because they wanted to be part of that giant multilateral trade agreement. And part of that on our end was, we want our workers to be competitive. So if you're going to trade with us, you need to not have slaves, okay? You can't pay 50 cents a day for your workers. You have to actually start to boost their wages. And that type of like positive influence is good for us. It's good for our pocketbooks. It's good for our influence around the world. And it's good for those other countries too, to some extent as well. Not to say that we're all noble,
Human rights has, it's been on the rise thanks to, I think, democracy. And it's hard to say these kind of quiet parts out loud, but like, our influence around the world is also, you get UN votes. Who's voting on our side when it comes to anything at the UN? If we lose influence in countries in Africa, we also lose votes. And that can have an effect on basically the world, the way the world's shaped, the way we see the world, and how we want people to interact with each other, like you're talking about, pay people what, a fair living wage versus what I would say the authoritarian vision of the world and what the world would look like if China were the leaders. I don't think it would be as good. I think it would be more Grozny's. But
like, people are upset about like how social media is ran for censorship or whatever, right? And now we're finally seeing the diverging opinions on TikTok being owned by China. But like, imagine also if Facebook was run by Saudi Arabia, and then imagine if like Amazon was run by Russia. And then like, the world could look so complete, and you would have no say over these companies whatsoever. Like, Americans, I think, take it for granted that we have so much cultural and economic domination over the world that we don't even stop and think for a second. Like, what does it mean that I can go to almost any city in the world and speak English? Or what does it mean that like my US dollar is valid for a currency exchange almost anywhere as an incredibly stable medium of currency? Why does everybody do business in dollars, denominated dollars? Like, I think it's a lot of taken for granted. You were going to ask questions too, sorry.
Yeah, I was just super interested. I feel like I've heard a lot of people connect the idea of military power to economics in how we're talking about specifically, but how much of like when people talk about spending, how much of our spending because we have such a large and capable military, also keeps our dollar valuable because our military can back up our dollar.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people would say, that there's an argument that our military force, the reason we invest so much in it is to protect the dollar.
Right.
That's
not
I've heard that
gold-backed,
argument.
it's military
Right.
backed.
Yeah, I've heard that argument. I agree. I think I sound a little bit like I'm making a case for imperialism and American empire, but I would say that all the great powers do it. China does it. Russia does it. They do it in different ways. All of these powers, you see Russia right now, they're moving in quite literally into Niger, where the U.S. military just got kicked out of. So imperialism, neo-imperialism, which is our influence through culture, through
Embassies and trade.
Right, military bases here and there. China's doing the same thing. They have police stations all over the world. And
They build ports that people can't afford the payments on, and then take them over and exclusively staff them with their own workers.
and they're trying to set up BRICS a little bit to be in competition with the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
And so I don't know exactly to the degree that the U.S. military backs that. I think I've looked into it, and I've tried to kind of quantify it and dig deeper into the numbers. And it's kind of a nebulous thing. It's like, how do you quantify that?
Yeah.
But it's a very good question.
Thing too, right? Because it's essentially saying like, well, we value you, your cultural hegemon, and your like dollar because you can kind of stomp us. Or if we're in dire straits, you can help us out.
The one thing that the United States did after World War II that I think was really, really great was the Marshall Plan, where we gave billions of dollars to help rebuild Europe. Like, I don't know that other countries, given the amount of power that the United States had, would go so long without abusing it. And the United States, I think, when they first started abusing it, was probably the war in Iraq, is one of the first cases that I see, like a clear, real, just terrible abuse of kind of, we took advantage of that position of being kind of on top.
I'll say, I think the world grew and learned. Because I think the world kind of changed how they did foreign power. So, for instance, you mentioned that like the different eras, we had like the colonialist era where people wanted colonies in places. After they moved on from taking them over. I would say that like after World War I, if you look at like Britain and France's application of mandates in the Middle East, they realized that like, okay, well, we don't want to run these places forever, and we probably don't even want to do colonization, so we'll eventually turn it over. And I think the United States in general has been pretty, like, we did our manifest destiny, we got our country, and then like we're chill. But because I know there are people raging right now, the subversive foreign policy that we had in the Cold War was probably not the best, but I think other countries might have done it more aggressively. Like what we did in South America, there was a lot of intervention there. It's probably not great, but I think other countries would have just taken those countries over.
I would like to talk about Latin America.
Okay.
If you guys are down to talk about Latin America.
Yeah.
Right now, Haiti is a whole
Crazy.
cluster.
Yes.
Excuse me. And there's a whole history of colonialism there, where France turned them into sugar plantation, then brought in 800,000 African slaves, then country fought for their independence. But for the Cold War aspect of Latin America is fascinating, because you look at a place like El Salvador, where we pumped $1 billion worth of arms into El Salvador during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and Iraq and a couple other countries, they pumped something like $2 million worth of arms for the guerrilla fighters there in El Salvador. And then what you saw happen was this boomerang blowback, as the CIA would call it, where so we fund these what they call death squads in El Salvador, and then we train them as well. And those El Salvador trained and stood up by the Americans, they then commit all these war crimes in the El Salvador Civil War. And then they go to the United States, and they end up becoming, have you heard of MS-13? So that's where MS-13 comes from, is El Salvador. And then we deport them out of America back to El Salvador. And then El Salvador becomes this gang haven over the decades. And
like
it's
Haiti
like,
is now.
And it's like, okay, so I get what people's point there would be, which is that look what U.S. influence did in a place like El Salvador. It's not pretty. So yeah, I'm
I would say,
sympathetic to that.
I think we have to be careful though, and people have a hard time with this. Retrospective analysis is so much different than prospective analysis because obviously the goal or the idea at the time is that that wouldn't happen, but I would be cautious because earlier, so right now we're talking about the idea is we should train some people to stand up against others because we feel like they'll represent our interests more with the death squads in El Salvador. We kind of signed off on that same idea earlier for the Sons of Palestine, where it's like, well, maybe if we train these fighters in the Middle East, they'll do better against this faction in the Middle East we don't like, kind of like we did with the Mujahideen, right? Maybe we could do it in Palestine. Maybe this time will work out. Sometimes it does kind of work out. And I think we don't get credit for those times. Everybody will use the Vietnam War as an example of a horrible U.S. war that we should have never been in. And it's like, maybe not. There are good, arguments on both sides of that. But a lot of the arguments that you would use against Vietnam, you would have used against the Korean War. And damn, South Korea is amazing. Holy shit. This is why I argue earlier that I hate that Iraq was so up because now Iraq becomes the lens that we analyze every foreign policy decision through. And it's like, well, do we want Ukraine to look like another Iraq? And it's like, Ukraine doesn't look anything like Iraq. Okay. In Iraq, we had to bullshit ourselves into thinking the people wanted America to come there. In Ukraine, Zelensky is begging the United States for help. And the people in Ukraine want to fight against Russia with every fiber of their being. It's not even remotely comparable. Yeah.
Can I ask us a grounded question? I'm so sorry, I'm going to pause this. I noticed that we've talked about Iraq a bunch and how it's failing, but I just want to maybe do a TLDR so that listeners who are maybe not familiar understand what went wrong about Iraq. We keep citing it as the point. So what was so wrong about it?
From a geopolitical perspective, we basically made Iran more powerful by toppling their adversary. We changed the balance of power in the Middle East, which then led to there's the uprisings in Syria, which destabilized essentially the whole region. Looking back on it with a sober, clear mind, you have that sober analysis, and you're like, oh boy, Syria and Iran and Iraq, everyone there must have just looked at the U.S. troop presence there and thought, where are they going next? They going into Syria? Are they going into invade Iran? Those were fears that those countries had. We destabilized that whole region, which then helped, I believe, and I'm sure there's counter arguments, but I believe it's part of what led to ISIS being able to form in the vacuum of power in Syria, which then trampled through Iraq. I remember when a couple of years after I got back from Iraq, I saw a news article about the base that I had been at, Mushada, had been overrun by ISIS. And I was like, oh, so that was all for nothing. That was the year I was there was just so that ISIS could go and take it over. And then we beat them back, which thank God for that. But Iraq was a geopolitical disaster, I think, in some aspects, because of the destabilizing effect. And we didn't go in there wanting to destabilize.
Right. Anything that you would add?
I to this day, I don't know why we did the Iraq war.
I think we got slapped pretty hard from 9/11 and we thought
it felt like Bush could have thrown a dart. I understand Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I don't understand Iraq. But the big issue with Iraq was we basically, I think one issue you run into is it's called feature creep in software development, mission creep, I guess, in the military world, is that we didn't have a clear mission initially. Mm-hmm. So what are we here to do? Because it wasn't just to get rid of Saddam Hussein, it was also all the stuff that came after.
Right.
But there's a whole bunch of reasons, and I don't know why. Maybe I'm just analyzing this now as a civilian who, I have the luxury of sitting in a fucking podcast studio and analyzing it. But because I see this come up a lot with Israel Palestine, people project way too much their desires and their mode of existence onto other people, and they make way too many assumptions, and in some ways it leads them to being way too arrogant and way too misinformed about what another people want. Being for Iraq, our understanding as enlightened liberals in the West is that everybody wants a democracy, and that would be the best way to go about everything. So if we topple some dictatorship and we give them a democracy, they're going to be grateful for it, they're going to love us, they're going to be our friends, and it's going to be great. And the way that we went about, and again, I'm retrospectively analyzing it, the way that we went about it is we essentially went in, we took apart the entire government, and you already had a situation where arguably you had a minority kind of suppressing a majority, because the Ba'ath Party, although it was supposed to be a secular dictatorship, I think it was generally staffed by Sunni people,
Sunnis,
right?
yeah.
And you have a majority Shia population, so now you're flipping the script, which I think also led to predictable things like death and torture camps and shit for now some of the other population, now that the Shia people came in power. I think under Maliki, I think a lot of that happened. But you took apart the government. You said if you were in the government, you're not allowed to ever participate in new government. So those people got banned. You brought in a new government, and there was just no clear roadmap or direction for what the fuck was going to happen afterwards.
Right.
And you're already in a region where there are so many people that want to have influence or push or have like some say in what's going on here, because you've got the whole IRGC is dedicated, your Quds Force, your Soleimanis who are like, well, I want to have a lot of influence in Iraq, and now you destroyed it. And then you've got your Baghdadis from Syria who are like, oh my God, there's so many places for my fighters to train.
Yeah.
You've got a whole ethnic group of Kurdish people there who are scattered among the Middle East who are like, can we have a country here now? Like, what's going on? And it just felt like very stupid. I don't know. But again, I have the vision, the luxury of retrospect, but
I have a tendency to do a lot sometimes of black and white thinking. And I'll say, to boil it down, I'll say that like Iraq was a disaster and it was a mistake. I'm sure that there's some people who benefited and their lives are probably better now
like
because of it in Iraq.
Yeah.
But I would say on a whole,
it was terrible for the region, the area. And the people.
There's estimates that something like 1 million civilians were killed during the 15 years we were there. I don't know if that's accurate. I wouldn't be surprised.
I think those numbers are a little wild. I know that there's one that gets thrown around a lot.
We flattened some of those cities.
But there were warnings for evacuations, everything first. It's not like we just came in and carpet bombed the fuck out of
that's one of the things I think is different between Gaza and Iraq, is that the people could leave Fallujah, for instance, but
more readily,
they can't as easily leave places in Gaza. Real quick to end the Latin America aspect of it, I think some of the decisions, like we're not responsible entirely for whatever instability or
and
violence,
everybody had their hands
violence,
on those countries too.
Cartels, cartel violence. Spain was a colonial power there for hundreds of years and basically left them with economies that were dependent on one product. So El Salvador, for instance, was entirely dependent on coffee. That was their only economic product. So there's a lot of places that people you could blame for that, but I think what we're seeing is all of those problems are coming home now to roost at the border, the problems there.
I was going to say the cartel is such an interesting conversation, because my understanding is one of the largest cartels in Mexico right now. One of the head guys was trained by U.S. military.
There was something called the Meridia Initiative, where the U.S. gave billions of dollars to Mexico to help train their forces to fight against the cartel. And there's, I think it's the Los Gatos, cats. It's the Cats cartel.
Yeah.
Los Zatos? I have it wrong, but one of the cartels is largely from people who are out of that initiative. But the cartel problem is crazy. You see Ecuador just recently, I don't know if you saw that, their government falling apart, or their gangs, prison breaks happening, and it's because so what we're seeing is this spilling over of cartels into different countries that before 3 years ago were very peaceful. So I wanted to kind of end what I was trying to say about Latin America.
Well, actually, it's interesting because it ties really well into understanding the immigration crisis that we're experiencing at the border specifically. When you look at all the cartels and the fighting that's going on, there's a lot of people saying like why there are just so many more people at the border. But probably part of it is I don't think most people are even aware of what's going on in most of Latin America. I don't think most people even understand that like Haiti's basically fallen. I don't think there's any established government at this point. Whereas El Salvador just got that new authoritarian guy who basically like militaried out Bukele. All of the criminals, right?
The President Bukele, who he rounded up 70,000 criminals and put them in prison and created giant prison camps, and people love him because now they can go outside freely and not have to worry about being attacked by gangs. So the border, I don't know how interested you guys are about the border. I feel like there's kind of two main viewpoints that you hear about. It's either these people are just coming here and they're just trying to get money and that's it, and then there's other people who feel like we should let them in, they're trying to escape violence. So the border is another disaster.
Going just to kind of finish this Latin America thing, where you said we kind of project onto others what we want, and we have to be careful about like the retrospect stuff. So we talked a bit about like the Cold War era in Latin America. So obviously you felt like it was not good, I think is what you had said. Whereas you said, well, let's be careful.
Sounds like you're kind of indifferent to it.
I think you had a great point, which is like, we don't know the counterfactuals of what would happen if we hadn't done it.
Right.
Like, would it be better if the Soviet-backed guerrillas had taken over El Salvador? I don't know.
Yeah, people, the problem is when there's this annoying saying that is the least true saying ever, and it's that history is written by the victors. It's not. History is written by historians, and people have a lot of things to say about history, and the idea that because the United States obviously emerged victorious from the Cold War, well, now we've got a society that is incredibly critical of our past, which I think is great, but we forget what a lot of the other countries' foreign policies looked like as well. When people are quick to say like, oh, didn't Al Qaeda and the Taliban, we trained the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right? Okay, well, why? Who are they fighting? Why did we train them? The Soviets were doing a lot of foreign intervention too. And you can look at a lot of military conflict. You can open the little Wikipedia and read the belligerent side, and you can see a lot of like, why am I looking at like the third war in Israel? How is Cuba involved in this? What? Or you can see, there's a lot of people that have their hands in a lot of things. And like you said, we don't have the historical counterfactuals. And when people compare a situation, all my best analogies right now are going to be the vaccines, but I'm not going to make them. I don't want to make it that political. But when people compare a situation, they'll always take what happened, and then they're like, well, what if we did, if we didn't do this? And they'll just remove all the side effects, and they'll pretend that like nothing else bad could have happened.
Right.
And it's such a dumb framing. It would be like going to the gym for 5 years and then being like, man, I'm so sore all the time. Like, what if I just didn't go to the gym at all? I would just be ripped without any pain. And they'd be like, yeah, like as stupid as that sounds, it feels like that is what people do. Yeah, there's no counterfactual analysis that takes into account, well, what are all the other potential ills or bads that could have come from anybody else doing things? Yeah. Before we jump to another macro issue, actually, I'm real curious on a personal level. It sounds like you were involved in actual combat operations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right
now, we are getting an unprecedented amount of field footage. And I don't want to load this. What do you think about that? We're seeing cameras from drones, from soldiers. What are your general thoughts on that?
So the reason I feel like I'm good at covering these conflicts is because I have a point of reference for the violence and the war, but it is really just a point of reference. I can't imagine what it's like. There's tank on tank battles, giant artillery duels. In all of the war in Iraq that I was participated in, we fired something like 60,000 shells during the entire war. That's how they fire that many I think Russia fires that many in 6 months. So the footage that's coming out of there is unreal. It's unbelievable. It's peer on peer combat, unlike anything we've ever seen before.
One of the things that I wonder when we look at the footage that's coming out now is, as what always happens when more transparency is given, you have this unparalleled level of criticism of people looking at a thing and going like, isn't this wrong? Or why do people do this? Do you ever worry or wonder, did people have a perception of what combat was like before, and now that they see footage, they're getting the wrong idea, or did they have the wrong idea before? Or I can narrow that more if you...
Yeah, so you're saying like...
So like, I think that military conflict is violent and it's brutal, and sometimes I see people will look at video footage of like a Ukrainian soldier shooting a Russian soldier, and they're like, well, this guy looked like he was surrendered, or this is immoral, or I can't believe these people are doing this. And now you've got people that are being like unfathomably critical at every single stage, whereas before there would have been a lot more fog of war. It's happening a lot right now for Israel and Palestine, where basically, like, I could never imagine being a military commander in the past where every single airstrike you're calling in is now getting worldwide critical analysis, that you've got 3 or 4 guys that are being tracked and bombed, and now the whole world has an opinion about how you've conducted this particular military operation.
I honestly think it might be a good thing. Mm-hmm. I think it could be good that there's more accountability for everything that happens. It's kind of like how I would probably equate it to...
Like body cams on police.
There's body cams on police officers, and what we see is that everybody, including the cop and the person, are now kind of held accountable. So yeah, if you do a bombing and you kill a bunch of civilians, yeah, maybe it's a good thing that we're all now able to see that in ways that we couldn't before.
Do you think there's an issue when the transparency is selective, when it's only coming from one side?
Yeah, that would definitely be an issue, because the weird thing is we got to see it with Hamas too as well. We got to I don't know if you
released
watched
a few videos. I have
yeah,
seen,
so that made me sick to my stomach, and I think a lot of people haven't. They've seen only the Israeli footage, and they're outraged by that. And then I think they probably haven't seen the footage of the people killed on October 7th.
I guess when I think about this, one concern that I have is that I feel like most typical civilians have basically no understanding or scope of understanding violence, like at all, right? I think about even social commentary. You've probably seen videos of like fights going viral and stuff, like just fist fights in America, and everyone's got a whole bunch of opinions about when he should have stopped or kept going, or whether that swing was okay or not, right? And when I watch that, I'm like, I've never been in a fist fight. I have no martial training. Never even been slapped before. Like, I have no idea what I'm looking at or what's reasonable to expect of an individual in that situation. And I know that I'm even less knowledgeable about watching a soldier, right? So I'm very nervous about making any specific indictments of moral claim on a soldier, because I have no idea what it's like to be in a firefight. I have no idea how I would decide between whether I think somebody is surrendering or not. And so I worry that when I see, especially like young people that are highly aversive to violence, watching this, that we get this weird skew view that like war is bad, and then like even more extreme of like all violence in any form is just always evil and bad, and we have like no conception of like what violence has to sometimes look like for these situations.
I do believe that there are some people that need to be killed. There's some people, some terrorists, that violence is the only thing that they understand, and it's terrible, but that's the case. And it is difficult to look at decisions that soldiers make in a split second, and then now we have the benefit of hindsight and the videotape, and we can say he made a mistake, but in the split second they had only a moment to decide one way or the other. So yeah, it's difficult to judge what people do.
But my concern is that you see now policy being formed, like people are making very strong claims about policy for Gaza, for example, that I feel like is largely driven for like people in a democratic country by what they're seeing in videos and whatnot that I know I don't understand very well.
I think what we're talking about a little bit right now is there's an enormous amount of civilians being killed in Palestine right now, in Gaza. It's hard to talk around. The estimates are something like 30,000 civilians killed at this point, and that's by IDF estimates, I believe, because they don't even kind of deny that. They're saying, they've come out and said that they believe that they kill 2 civilians for every one Hamas fighter that they kill. That's what they're saying. And they've communicated that they believe they've killed 13,000 Hamas fighters so far. So double that, 26,000. So everyone's kind of in agreement that there's a lot of civilians are dying.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, okay, then now what's the solution for that? And how do you solve for that if the only way to kill these Hamas fighters that need this killing, what do you do? So far, Israel, I think they've only lost it's a tragedy all around. I don't mean to minimize it. 256, something like that, soldiers have died, and they've been able to lose such a few amount, relatively speaking, because they bomb a place instead of going and doing a surgical raid. And can you blame them? Should they put soldiers' lives in danger, or should they send that JDAM bomb?
Right.
It's personally, I wouldn't want to trade my life. I don't know. I feel like it's tough. It's really tough.
Something you brought up that's really interesting is this idea of more accountability. So when you look at people that conduct military strikes, you've got all of these rules relating to distinction and proportionality that are these, I say unwritten, really written rules of war for how you're supposed to conduct yourself. And in the past, you can operate under the fog of war, and you're a little bit like beyond reproach because nobody really knows what's happening day to day, right? Until probably the invasion of Iraq. That was probably the first. Did they call that one the TV war? Or was it before?
Vietnam was
I've heard
broadcast, but not.
I think Iraq was the first. Well, I say first time. I wasn't alive for Vietnam, but like you saw like troop numbers on the video on the TV screen where all of our armies were, and there was so much footage that was starting to come out of that for real.
Yeah.
So now you've got more transparency now because you're getting information on individual strikes. You've got the geolocators on Twitter that are like looking at video footage from all over YouTube and the latitude longitude for everything. What do you think, given this level of transparency, we can see in some ways it could be problematic because people are making bad judgments or assessments or assuming that somebody's being uniquely bad or evil. But then, like you said, it actually gives us some more insight into what's happening. Could there be a good accountability mechanism for evaluating how a country does their operations? Like, say Israel does a strike on a building, 100 people are killed, and Israel goes, trust me, this strike was worth it. We don't really get any insight into what that means. Is there any possible way that could be done? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, sometimes they'll say, oh, this strike, we killed a leader of Hamas.
Sure.
Is that what you're getting at?
Sometimes, basically, because because there's an implicit trust for every military that you are doing a good proportionality assessment, but then things will happen like that WCK bombing where it's like, okay, wait, well, what the fuck was the assessment here? Yeah.
For proportionality, I get where that logically tracks, but in war, I've never understood why you would be proportional with
when I say proportionality, what I mean is that like you're going to incur some civilian loss of life for a military strike. So for instance, if I bomb an apartment and 100 people are killed and it comes out, well, 95 were civilians and 5 were Hamas, and you go, well, trust me, those are really important people. You're not obligated to publish any information about it, but I think we would obviously like to know. Is there any way that you think from like a bureaucratic point of view or a bureaucratic point of view that you can have more insight into those decisions without it compromising military operation? Yeah?
You could control it. But is that what you're getting at? Like control. There are bureaucratic levers that you can. Well,
no, I know Israel can, but I'm saying the outside world because we're watching them do military operations, and we want to say, hold on, I think this strike was wrong. Is there a way that you can implement like a system in a military that would give you insight into what they do without compromising operations? That makes sense.
Yeah, like from an intelligence point of view, no, I don't. I think people are either sold on it or not. Kind of at this point, you're not going to convince people that there's. I maybe it's just my perception of it, but I feel like people are either like in the belief camp of Israel should be able to defend themselves and do what they need to do, or there's people who feel like they just need to stop and there needs to be a ceasefire. At this point in the conflict, it feels like it's at that. At that point.
I do think some of the published stuff,
right? They're at. This is the last. There's 1 million people in Palestine, in Gaza. Rafah is supposedly the last. There's 4 battalions of Hamas left there. And so the question just kind of comes down to, should they be able to go in and can they finish the job? Could they? A lot of people like to say you can't kill an idea. I don't know if that's true. I think
we beat the Nazis in Japan.
There's some ideas. There are some ideas that are hanging on by a thread because of the amount of bullets that have been fired at them. But Hamas, it's a unique situation there because they can't get reinforced. And also they don't need to kill every Hamas soldier. They don't need to destroy them in detail. They just need to get them out of power. They just need to replace them so that they're no longer a government functioning over Gaza. Sure. That's where I think all of this went to hell, is when they were able to take control of Gaza. That's when this all became kind of an inevitable situation leading to here. But yeah, I think there's a case to be made that they could remove them from power. They might have to occupy the place for a long time. But yeah, it's brutal because they're going to have to go into Rafah probably. And then after that, they're probably going to have to push the Hezbollah soldiers off of their northern border. Because what people aren't thinking about as much right now is that there are just large sections of Israel from their point of view, from their perspective, that is also unlivable for their civilians. Something like 100,000 civilians are not able to live in their homes in northern Israel because of the conflict with Hezbollah. So
of like indiscriminate bombing and missiles and stuff.
Yeah, and also there's just this implicit threat that they could do what Hamas did and launch an attack. So they feel as though they're unsafe there. So, yeah.
Okay. What do you think, I'm just curious because we're here, what do you think the end state, a positive end state for the entire world looks like between Gaza and Israel, just for this war, not for all of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Like, let's say Hamas is destroyed, who is the new government, or what? Does Israel start rebuilding settlements there for security purposes? Do they occupy it permanently and not allow a new administration?
They would probably put a new something like the PLO. They would probably put something that they felt like they could work with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think Ukraine, and then for the end state for Ukraine, Russia, if Ukraine is like fully unleashed to fight as much as they're able to, given unlimited access into U.S. Military stockpiles, does Ukraine have a positive outlook on their conflict, or do you not think so? Or?
I've always kind of felt like the DoD and the different. I feel as though they've always held back a little bit, even when we've got the $95 billion that we've given them now, made available to them. We gave them 31 Abrams tanks. We've got something like 3,000 in stock. We could have given them a lot more than we did. Feels like we kind of gave them enough to
just prolong the bullshit.
To get by.
Not even just, I don't know if I would say prolong, but we did. I don't know that the United States thought it would be great if Ukraine took Crimea back, because I think if I'm putting myself in the shoes of of the chief of staff in the military, I would be planning that would lead to potentially heightening the threat of nuclear war if Ukraine successfully retakes Crimea and retakes all of that land.
Because it would agitate Russia so much.
Yeah.
I guess it's irritating because it's indecision is a decision. And it's very annoying that it feels like internally the U.S. hasn't taken a strong stance on what Ukraine should be doing. So Ukraine is left in the worst state of limbo
2 years of war.
You can't really push because you don't know if you're going to have shells next month, and you don't know, you really have no idea. Like if you're in Ukraine, it could be that next year the United States is like, fuck it, $400 billion weapons package, like good luck. Or it could be like, we're going to need you to negotiate like an off ramp because we don't really want to support this anymore at all. And it's like, well, how do you conduct yourself at that point? Yeah.
Their hands are a little bit tied. But they're making moves. They're trying to do a mobilization of something like 500,000 soldiers. I don't know every time I've tried to predict what will happen there, I get very surprised by what happens. So I wouldn't.
Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think Ukraine's situation is surprising you so often?
There hasn't been really a point of reference for such a large scale conflict. So I think a lot of military analysts read it wrong. Everyone thought Ukraine was going to. Yeah, exactly. So because we didn't have a point of reference of how effective the Javelin was going to be. We'd only ever used it on caves in Afghanistan. So we didn't realize that it would be very effective against an armored column. So
we also don't know we didn't know to that point, like how effective the Russian military against a formidable foe, or any foe, I guess, actually was. Yeah.
Right. We way overestimated their strength.
Yeah. And as did Russia probably. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So right now, it looks like, in your guys' perspective, that Ukraine is going to be stuck in this limbo until somebody decides either to like make them off ramp or give them a massive payout, because they just can't. They have procurement issues essentially.
So they have no industrial base, no MIC there even at all.
Yeah.
Any weapons that they get from foreign aid from outside. The U.S. sends it, or France, or other countries. But I'm sorry, you say the last part again?
Basically, like, it seems like for Ukraine, because it's foreign aid dependent, there's like this procurement issue. So like there is no end in sight until somebody makes a decision as to like whether they are off ramping and saying like, "Hey, we're done. You're not getting Crimea. You're not getting this."
So I would put it on a scale of like likely to unlikely. I would say the most likely thing that people are saying is that, or analysts believe and experts, is that it will be a frozen conflict. But there is also the possibility that maybe through attrition, Russian forces get ground down. They run out of vehicles and equipment, and they're not able to produce more. It's a possibility.
Right.
They look at the production numbers coming out of Russia. They run these numbers of attrition and just if you're losing this many tanks at this rate, how many years can you sustain this? Apparently, they believe Russia can sustain this fighting for 2 years, at least at this rate.
2 more years?
Right.
Okay.
At this rate. but rates can change.
Yeah.
And
what does it look
it's-
like if other countries supporting them ramp up production on certain supplies that they need, and then they've got
There's
more,
so many different factors that go in
Yeah.
that's part of the reason why every time I've tried to think, oh, this is what's going to happen 2 weeks from now. I'm like, oh, there's 8 other factors that I didn't even think about.
Right.
There's, but an interesting piece to that possibility is if the front lines in Ukraine did start to crumble, what we're seeing now is, I don't know if you've heard, but places like France are saying that they would send forces into Ukraine, actually boots on the ground, to prevent basically Russia from collapsing all of Kyiv.
Yeah,
So-
and I don't believe you can trigger Article 5 if your soldiers are killed in another nation. So if French troops get killed in Ukraine, it's not technically a threat for NATO versus Russia because they're not in their home territory.
And having them there might be enough to just prevent Russian forces from taking. The idea is to just prevent them from probably the Dnipro River is where they would want to stop them.
Yeah, although I feel like at that point you also have to negotiate with Zelensky for what the end point looks like, because I don't think that Western powers are going to want to station troops in Ukraine and have them work as a defensive force while Ukrainian soldiers are performing offensive forces. That's probably not something that they'd be too keen on.
I think it is probably exactly what they would do.
You really think so?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it's something very similar to what China did in the Vietnam War, for instance. They sent billions of dollars of aid into Vietnam. They sent hundreds of thousands, millions of artillery shells into Vietnam. They sent, it was during a 5-year period, they sent something like 300,000 Chinese soldiers into North Vietnam to defend basically defend their back, while the North Vietnamese.
Yeah.
So I think it could be something similar to that.
I feel like for those conflicts, I feel like it was a little bit different because I feel like it's going to sound weird, but I feel like during the Cold War, when you're looking at things like Vietnam or Korea or anything else, those are like real wars. And the war in Ukraine and Russia feels very much like fictitious unless you're in Ukraine. Like, it doesn't really feel like we have this idea that Russia is going to war with a European country and trying to steal land from them, at least in America.
I feel like it's almost more overt because
think so?
people can't hide anything anymore. Like nobody really knew during the Vietnam War the involvement of China. China never admitted it until years and years later when it came out how much they supported Vietnam. So did the Soviets. That all came out years and years later when the Soviet Union fell and all their books were opened up. We learned a lot about their involvement there. They were helping shoot down American aircraft, kind of like how we're helping coordinate. So I feel like it's weird. The weird thing about Ukraine is how overt it is.
But I feel like
everyone's gone mask off and is like, well, okay, we're fighting each other here.
Yeah.
Just here
I guess it feels
Ukraine.
weird because I feel like the
strange proxy war.
Yeah, it feels like I guess it's weird because it feels like so many excuses are being made for it. Like, I hear, for instance, a lot of comparisons between, well, if the United States invaded Iraq, then Russia should be able to invade Ukraine.
That's a bizarre analogy.
I know, but I
heard.
Yeah,
and
like the idea that you can come in and like, yeah, exactly.
Iraq.
But like, that's a minor point. People seem to not care about the territory, and that's a big deal. I think that like a country is coming in and basically saying like, these parts of your country are no longer your country. And for all the faults and criticisms that I think everybody here has for the Iraq invasion, I think we all agree it wasn't territorial conquest. We weren't going there ever with the idea of we're going to make a colony and this is going to be new Iraq or whatever. Yeah.
Even the oil. Where's the money that we were supposed to get? Supposedly we went there for oil, but we never really saw
the massive extractions.
Right.
All the oil coming out.
Right. We lost money. I mean, we put, yeah.
Do you think the difference in perspective that you two are having on how people are viewing this war is selection bias? Or do you think, because I'm curious, I suspect that you're in a much more like military world that's going to be focused probably more normie as well.
I would just say I'm right and he's wrong.
I think it comes down to that.
No, I'm really.
Don't give him that.
I think we're talking about the term differently.
A little bit, yeah, I think so.
I think we're using different definitions of like
everybody is like, yeah, we're at war, but it feels it feels like a lot more kind of like outside of Ukraine, at least. It feels more, and I can't speak for Europeans, it feels more like kind of like a game or like kind of funny or like Russia's like kind of up to their like hijinks or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas like the Vietnam War was like, we're at war. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like
yeah, but I think there's also, it's probably like the personal involvement might change it a bit too.
Yeah, it might a lot come down to the fact that we're not there, so it's easy to feel disconnected and not have like a personal attachment.
Yeah. And then I think there's just a lot of that taken for granted in terms of like how stable and peaceful relatively, absent maybe like collapse of Yugoslavia or whatever, Europe has been for a while. The idea that another country could just march in and start taking territory is such an unfathomable idea in current year. And people just don't seem to have the visceral response to that I would have hoped or would have expected people to have. Yeah.
So I think the way that analogy holds up to the degree that it does is that we invaded a sovereign country and we toppled their government. So that's kind of where the analogy ends. The United States shouldn't have been able to do that.
Yeah.
Russia is doing something similar. They're invading a sovereign country, but it's very different to annex the territory.
Yeah.
So that's where I think the analogy for people would fall apart.
Of all the stuff that you go over, what are some things, what do you think is like the most important things that you think people should know? Like what are misconceptions or things that you talk about or ideas that people have where you're like, why do people think this thing? I wish I could mind wipe this thing. I don't know what that means. What?
Talking to her. Ignore it.
Okay.
The misconceptions around the military industrial complex is the big one that I think a lot of people didn't understand, that I'm glad that I got to talk a little bit about here. I don't know. It's a good question.
What are like some of the most frequent, like irritating comments you see or questions that you get? Like, do you ever see people show up?
People say I'm a shill, that I'm all for every kind of military intervention, or I think but just by the fact that I cover military conflicts and I cover gear and I do cover military weapons designs and I geek out on it, it's easy to see that, and people will comment and say, oh, he's just all for the military industrial complex. But I do have, war is awful. It's hell. And I understand that. I've been a part of accidental, mistakes where I helped call in an Apache strike on a position that turned out to be a Sons of Iraq position. They were asking, are they digging out there? I'm using a thermal imaging device to view them, and I'd say, yeah, they're digging. And then next thing I know, they get lit up with the Apache's cannon and just torn to pieces. And I've seen how that you're playing a game of telephone. It's the most high stakes game of telephone ever.
Right.
You're telling the commander who's talking to the Apache, and that communication is deciding somebody's life. And I understand how easy it is for these things to go sideways. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think maybe there's a perception that I don't appreciate how awful some of these things are.
Do you feel like with your background and with your current coverage of events, do you stop and think or worry that you're doing like propaganda for the military? Do you feel that pressure sometimes to be more critical or less critical?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, that's actually I'm glad you brought that up. It's one of the biggest things. I always get called propaganda, which is frustrating because I don't think that they're mad that I'm propaganda, because then they'll say, you shouldn't watch Chris because he's propaganda. You should watch RT. They really know what's going on. And I'm like, okay, so you don't care if I'm propaganda or not. You just are unhappy that I'm not saying the thing that you want to be said. And there's, I think, a big difference between that. So, I mean, I try my best to cover things from different perspectives. I try to tell people where my bias is and what the different perspectives are. And yeah.
Do you have a general feeling or connection to vets that watch your stuff? Do you get a lot of people that message you and say like, I can't believe you say this shit, you used to be in the military, why the fuck do you talk about this? Or people that are like, it's cool that somebody was there and is speaking out, or is it just like a variety of opinions like ordinary civilians?
I get a variety of opinions. I certainly feel the pressure a lot of times. It can be difficult. My true north is just, I try to tell people the truth and what I believe. And if people, it sucks a lot of times because it's hard to build an audience that way. It's really difficult to build a community of people who don't agree with each other, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do. So, and so social media, I'm sure you probably, well, I don't know if this is as big of a problem on all platforms, but like,
okay.
And I feel like you're actually particularly good at you have audience from all over the spectrum of politics.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with your conflict.
Right.
Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know what I'm
my
talking
Twitter over the past 2 days. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
So it's very, very difficult to get people together. Because let's say I make a video on, let's say I make a video that's positive towards Israel, and I add, let's say, 1,000 subscribers who are like, oh, he loves Israel, and then if I make a video that is a little bit critical of them, now I have 1,000 people that are going to dislike that video. So it becomes very difficult. And you know how the algorithm works, it then deprioritizes your video. So I've just kind of had an attitude of like, well, screw it. If people are going to dislike it.
The issue is I imagine from what I'm hearing of you, for what I'm hearing you say is that you want to grab people and you want to give them a particular like form of analysis, and then your opinions are relating to it. And that whole process is really important. But it's very fucking annoying, and I have this a lot, where people will show up and they'll say something along the lines of like, Destiny is so smart and insightful, and I love it when he talks about X, Y, and Z, but oh my God, when he talks about A, B, and C, he is so fucking clueless and deranged and unhinged, and he has no idea what's going on here. And when I see comments like that, I'm like, okay, well, I want you to like take all of this, but it sounds like you just like this part from like these three opinions and like get the fuck out of my, I don't know why the fuck you're watching me. I've done a lot of Israel Palestine coverage recently, and I can feel I've grown a huge fan base of like Israeli people that are watching me, and I have a lot of criticisms for the Israeli government, but I'm always fighting against pro-Palestinians here in wherever the fuck I inhabit online. And yeah, I can feel that coming up, as I'm sure you do, where you cover certain things, you're like, oh boy, like a lot of fans here are really primed for this shit, and I'm not what they think I am. And then when the next video or two comes out, you're like, all right, let's do it. Like, time for the purge. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then so I have weird periods where it'll be like you get a lot of views, and then afterwards you have to dump a lot of audience. And
wait, how? Just on that in particular, how do you resist, or do you think about becoming audience captured? Because I'm sure there've been points where I don't know if this was on the show before. You mentioned like you covered something, you got like 50,000 people from a thing. Do you ever think like, I should just fucking cover this?
There's the like, what do you call it? It's tempting, but I'm just too much of a contrarian. There's like a part of me that is
like needs to fight,
like enjoys
being the different thinker.
Yeah, like I get a perverse satisfaction out of being subversive, but not for the sake of it, but just like I couldn't live with myself. The whole point of the thing, like, it would just be pointless but I could see it happen to people. You can see people see the especially like the monetary incentive for just doubling down. And sometimes I'll sit there and I'm like, when I'm getting a dislike ratio that's really sucks, and I mean, by nature, I'm someone that kind of like wants to be liked also as well. So it sucks, but I couldn't think of doing it any other way. The thing that makes me upset is that right now, the platforms that we're on do not, I think, account for it well. Like they certainly do have, it seems like, something in place where even if you're getting dislikes, it'll still be surfaced, but it's still, you can't grow an audience that way.
Right.
And it's the legacy networks have this problem as well. It's why you see Fox and MSNBC are like totally captured by their audience. Yeah.
How many people do you work with now? Like, what is this whole, like, your project for YouTube and everything? Like, how many people are involved in there? And then do you think about like their jobs? So like, if you're thinking that like, I'm going to cover this thing and a lot of people are going to be mad, do you start to feel more pressure? Because it's like, oof, like, I don't know if this will have like a downstream negative impact on any of the people that I work with, or
Yeah, I try not to I definitely have those moments and I'll like talk to my fiance about it. Caitlin, she's amazing. I love her. And she's very insightful and helpful and keeps me sane. But I always come back to just, I couldn't do it any other way. I really couldn't. And I guess there's a part of me that feels like maybe someday that'll be like a good thing, that I have a group of people who aren't just, when I start hearing, when it starts feeling like there's seals clapping and they're just like, like, yeah, kill those bad guys. It starts to feel like, oh, I'm contributing to something not good here.
Yeah.
Like, this is not good.
Okay.
I don't know. Like, I'd be curious to know, because I do feel like, actually, it's funny. I feel like I'm sitting with one of the people who has like kind of avoided this problem the best. I have a lot of the same feelings as you, though. I used to try to like avoid all the emotional stuff, but now I just try to be aware of it because I don't think you can avoid it. But
luckily, I think I'm primed, and it sounds like you are too, with a lot of emotional drives that, if directed correctly, can be really beneficial. If there are a lot of people agreeing with me, and I know that we would disagree on something else, I enjoy that second disagreement, because it's like, oh, you guys thought that you were beyond reproach because you did a good thing here. I think October 7th was a horrible, tragic event, but if this happened to settlements in the West Bank, I wouldn't give a fuck, because you guys have completely fucked that up there, and you have completely called upon yourself like this issue, right? So like, if you think that I'm wholly siding with all the policy that you guys are doing, it's absolutely wrong. And I enjoy that riling up of somebody afterwards, where it's like, you're agreeing with me, but I know it's for the wrong fucking reasons, and I know that if I hit this other trigger point, you're going to self-destruct, and I want that to happen. Yeah.
So you know what I think is that I think you're in a position to reach those people in a unique way that like most people kind of cannot reach those people. And my intuition is that you can kind of a little bit help move things, not you personally, I'm just saying like there is a possibility to move people more towards reasonable positions that way. Like you're not, if there is a place for preaching to the choir, but I do feel like at a certain point preaching to the choir can feel empty.
Not even, yeah. I don't know how you feel about it, but like what you were saying before, like the seal clapping, like I hate it. Like when I go to these events, like these conservative events or whatever, it's so funny because I just had that same exchange that you did. I was at a conservative event in Austin where I think it was at this event. I asked the guy, I'm like, okay, you guys don't trust any of the intelligence agencies. You don't trust CNN. You don't trust press, but you guys trust RT? Like why? You know, and like the whole audience boos, and I'm like yes, boo me, you fucking morons. Like, yeah, you guys are ridiculous. Yeah, it feels better to me than when I'm in an area. It's a meme on my stream because I have like people be like, you should talk to this guy or this guy, this guy. It's like, I think we'd agree on everything. Like, find me somebody I can fight with. Like, it's just I have that like emotional drive, and as long as it's like aimed decently well, it benefits you in terms of being honest. But then in terms of growing or navigating internet spaces, it can be really difficult because now you don't have a community that will always have your back. You have your community, but you can't tie yourself into any larger social communities or movements, and you might permanently be at ends with them. Like I just got involved with some massive fights with people that aren't even political, but they're huge YouTuber people. And the only impression they have of me is that I'm like pro-genocide. And it's like such an irritating thing to fight with. And I know where the other community, where it comes from. And it's like, Jesus. And these are people who don't even know like what the constituent elements of genocide even are. I have no idea what they're talking about. It's like, fuck, this is irritating. But now their audiences are hearing it. And yeah, that's not having like the predefined social or political movements you can kind of just like plug into and have them always like defending you no matter what is very alienating or frustrating or isolating or
you almost then you're like basically you can make enemies with both sides. But the thing that I do enjoy about it is I've noticed over the years that the audience has influenced me a lot in my thinking, and I get to learn from having a kind of a disparate group of people in the comments. I'll see things and I'm like, oh, like they make a good point. Maybe I should think about that thing that I said. So I get to hear a lot of creative things about negative comments about me that when you distill it into a constructive criticism, I feel like helps me grow. Whereas, you know, if I were to just put myself in an echo chamber, it'd be comfortable, but there's really less growth there.
That's a really difficult thing to do. And you mentioned that actually at the very beginning of the show, when we asked about your background, you had mentioned that you'd made a video about, what they called BTRs, the vehicles. Yeah, and you're like, some guy was like, why do you do fucking memes, you retard? Like, you should blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh shit, maybe I could. Being able to extract useful criticism from hostile comments is a very difficult thing to do. And I'll usually I'll have a day or two where I'll just be like mad as fuck. And it's like, I'm banning all you fucking morons. Like, ban, fuck you guys. But then I'll go back in like a day or two and it's like, okay, everybody's mad for a particular reason. Why is this valid? Like, or even if it's not valid, at least where is it coming from? Can I recognize it? Do I need to adjust behavior accordingly? Like, that's a very, very, very difficult thing to do, I think.
It is. It's because it'll start to kind of wear on you, like you said, right? At a certain point, it starts to become like, you don't want the seal clapping, but you also don't want to feel like it's all negativity and
reinforcing that.
Right. And it's a very difficult balancing act.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we haven't asked you that we should have?
Boy, I think we covered you guys really great questions. You thought of questions I never would have thought of thinking to ask. So
Okay. Well, hey, it's been a fun chat. I enjoyed it. Good luck on your YouTube stuff. Do you have any like fun projects, a book, a documentary, or just a YouTube channel where you want to direct people to if they're looking for you or trying to find anything?
I don't have anything fun to plug really, other than you could find me at Cappy Army on Twitter, Instagram, and you can find me at Task and Purpose YouTube channel. And yeah, that's it.
That's
Okay.
it.
Cool.
All right. Thanks for coming on. I super appreciate it.
Yeah,
Learned a lot.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot.
That'll be everything.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. I don't know why I'm looking at the camera. I don't know what the fuck I'm going to tell you, but yeah, we'll see you next episode. Have fun.
Check out our sponsors or something.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
The news
Ground news
is
was good.
divided. Ground news puts it back together with coverage from thousands of outlets around the world in one place. So you can spot sensational reporting, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. Beside every headline, you'll see who owns the source, how reliable it is, and if they have a political bias. Multiple perspectives side by side, giving you a well-rounded view of today's biggest stories. Visit ground.news to learn more.